Good morning, everybody. Welcome back for day 2. I can tell by some of the discussions that were had yesterday afternoon, evening, and already this morning that this forum has had impact. We all know that coming to forums like these is so fantastic, not just to meet other people with like minds, even different minds, and have discussions that need to be had, but we go home with a whole lot of stimulus, of motivation, of new contacts that can help each of us progress what we need to progress in sport to keep making it better. For those that weren't here yesterday, my name's Tracy Holmes, I'm your MC. And just as a reminder, all logistical information that you need, including the biographies of our excellent speakers throughout the day, also the hashtags that we'll be using in all social media posts, how to raise questions using slido.com so that you can send questions through to any of the speakers during the session, and details of the event code of behaviour and safeguarding support can all be found in the Sporting Chance Forum LinkedIn group. So if you haven't already joined up to that, please do so. Just as a reminder also, Wi-Fi at the Palais des Nations is UNOG public Wi-Fi. There's no password needed. There are closed captions on the screens during the sessions, which can also be accessed on the UNTV video feed, but we regret that that is only going to appear in English. For those in the room who need interpretation, it is available in front of you, and you can tap onto the buttons there. You'll find translations in French and Spanish. Now, we're going to start with some opening remarks. I'm going to hand over to our opening session. Mary Harvey is part of that, our host and Chief Executive from the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. She's going to provide some reflections on what we heard yesterday. Mary's going to be joined on stage by our host here in Geneva, and in fact, our first speaker, Tatiana Valovaya, the Director General of the UN Office in Geneva, followed by Daphne Panayotatos, the Open Society Foundation. So if all three could please come up to the stage here, and please everybody, make them welcome. And I'll hand first to Tatiana.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear Ms. Harvey, Excellencies, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all for this second day of the Sporting Chance Forum. And first of all, let me thank the co-organizers of the forum, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the International Labour Organization, and of course our host country, Switzerland. And especially I would like to thank Ms. Harvey and the whole team of the Center for the Sport and Human Rights for making this forum such a success. Finally, I would like to extend my very special recognition to Ms. Mary Robinson, Honorable Chair of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, whose dedicated long-term efforts actually made this center and today's event possible. Of course, I think it's emblematic that this edition of Sporting Chance Forum is taking place in the Human Rights and Alliance of Civilization room of our historical Palais des Nations. That's the place where Human Rights Council regularly meets. I sincerely hope that the discussions stemming from this today's forum would be helpful in shaping a more just and inclusive future for sports, free from discrimination, violence, and other human rights abuse. This year marks the 5th anniversary of the Center for Sports and Human Rights, and since its inception in 2018, the Center has tirelessly promoted equity, tolerance, and peace in the world of sport. Those are values that the United Nations holds very dear. This anniversary aligns with another very significant milestone, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which stands as a timeless beacon articulating the inalienable rights and fundamental freedoms to which all human beings are entitled. At 75 years, the Declaration's legacy in promoting dignity, equality, and justice for all remains profound. As a key reference, it shapes UN discourse and actions, integrating its universal principles into every aspect of our work everywhere. The Declaration, being, by the way, the most translated document in the world, underlines the roles of every individual and every organ of society in advocating and protecting human rights. The sports sector has a great potential in this regard, from promoting fairness, respect, and gender equality to advocating for the rights of marginalized groups and non-decriminalization. Sport has emerged as a dynamic force that not only entertains, but also champions the principles of human rights on a global scale. Large sports events like the Olympic Games can have a considerable impact on a variety of human rights, including the rights of citizens in the host countries, the fundamental freedoms of athletes, journalists, and spectators, as well as the rights of workers involved in construction sites and supply chains. Sport has the unique power to unite, ignite inspiration, and catalyze positive change. It transcends geographical boundaries, cultural differences, and languages, embodying the very essence of solidarity and respect. A world of sport free from racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance should be our collective task. It is only by working together that we can shape a future where respect for human rights is integrated into the core of every sporting activity. With its uniquely unifying power, sport should remain an important element of multilateral cooperation in the 21st century. In addition to its beneficial role in easing political tensions and rebuilding trust between nations, international sport diplomacy has also demonstrated results in tackling one of the biggest issues of our times, climate change. Sport is a key social platform that can reach and influence millions of people worldwide, in particular young people, and raise awareness on the climate emergency, promote a culture in favor of climate action, and champion sustainable development. The Sport for Climate Action Framework, launched in 2016 by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is nowadays one of the most represented global initiatives aimed at supporting and guiding sports actors in the global fight against climate change. I commend nearly 250 sports entities worldwide which have established climate actions in their agendas, many of them making additional commitments to achieving specific climate goals of halving emissions by 2030 and aiming to achieve net zero by 2040. Sport is uniquely placed to use its significant powers of inspiration and influence to promote greater environmental responsibility. By fighting for human rights in sports, we fight for peace and sustainable development. However, through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, promoting and upholding human rights in the world of sport is key in helping to build a prosperous and sustainable future for all. Let the insights that are being shared at this forum guide us in shaping a future where sports serve as a force for good for everyone, everywhere. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Daphne Paniutatis with the Open Society Foundations, and we are very proud and excited to be involved in supporting the forum this year and all of the incredible work that the Center for Sport and Human Rights is doing. Though we may be a new partner here, we are not entirely new to the space of sport and human rights. And in fact, looking at OSF's historical approach can help us understand why it made so much sense for us to be a partner in this and to support this incredible work. The Open Society Foundations are the largest private funder of democracy and human rights around the world, and we have a very people-focused approach centering the work of independent groups and individual activists, like some of the incredible athletes that we saw yesterday who are using their voices to speak out for rights. We look to empower and support individual activists and groups, and we base our work on three guiding principles three principles that are really defining characteristics of a truly open society, those being justice, equity, and expression. And I think we saw yesterday so clearly from the comments how those principles are also key to making sure that are also core to the spirit of sport and to making sure that sport is a space that is also open and inclusive. We do see a need to capitalize on this moment of the anniversary of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to use it to double down on human rights, our commitments to human rights. Open Society recently launched one of the largest global studies of public opinion on democracy and human rights that found that although the vast majority of individuals around the world still believe that human rights are relevant and reflect their values, they don't always have confidence that they're able to use human rights as a tool, to leverage human rights as a tool to be able to access their fundamental freedoms and rights. And they cite, for example, in the study, the study cites findings that individuals don't always feel that there has been efforts to properly deliver on addressing climate change, economic inequality, and discrimination, and other factors that are core to them. So we see this moment as one in which we can all gather and come together, working through new approaches and with new actors to support this movement that so many of us are part of, both by support to traditional actors like OHCHR and new ones in these ways that can make rights feel more inclusive and global, and tapping into that universality of rights that we spoke about yesterday, parallel to the universality of sport. It also means engaging in and using new spaces. This was the point that Ruben Escalante made yesterday with Global Citizens, Global Citizens initiatives using music like sport as a new platform to discuss and really have some of the difficult conversations that are so important to realizing rights. I think that this space of sport, and thanks in large part to the work of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, is one where we do see such diverse stakeholders coming together. It's not just the domain of governments and corporations, but also of people, both of individual athletes who are taking, as we heard yesterday, sometimes incredible risks to use their voices, to talk about their lived experiences and the need for protecting rights, but also for many of us as fans. The movement for around ESG, I think, has largely taken off because of demands from consumers. And in the world of sport, we as fans are also consumers. So I think it's a really powerful space where different groups are coming together to be able to make change. And there are so many incredible groups there for us to support and individuals for us to support, which makes this a really key opportunity for all kinds of actors to engage. I think another way we can look at sport is not just as a space in which we need to improve and strengthen access to rights, but also as a platform. And we saw this very much with the work of the Center's 75 by 75 campaign, where athletes were given space to speak themselves in their own voices, delivering messages that I know resonated with so many of us, and that so many of us were inspired by their bravery and their ability to speak out on these issues. I think this highlighted the point that was also made yesterday about the importance of not just rights, but dignity in rights, and the need for protecting rights in the sports space to ensure that athletes can show up as their full selves and as their best athletes and realize their potential. Despite these hopeful signs, there are still many challenges. We see around the world the proliferation of crisis, dangerous polarization, fraying multilateralism, and we also recently published a study that makes some proposals on ways to strengthen rights, to refresh the narrative and make it feel relevant and universal. We heard yesterday Stan Grant say the opposite of truth is not lies, it's power. And Keith Richards later said, or asked us the question of why there is so much resistance to change. And I think one of the answers to that question, an obvious answer to that question is power, the unwillingness sometimes to be seen to cede power. But as we heard from Natalie Washington, rights are not, it's not a zero-sum game, right? We can actually expand the pool to make sure that all individuals have access to their rights. So I think we heard some really powerful messages yesterday, and this should all motivate us to think about the role that we can play in this diverse ecosystem of sport. I'm here to talk a little bit more about the role of philanthropy. We heard so many times yesterday that we can each find our ways of contributing. We have to recognize also the need to work together. And someone said yesterday that we can't just talk about change, we can't just talk about change, we have to actually act to create change. But we also can't expect people to act if they are not properly resourced to do so. So this is one way in which philanthropy can really help to give support to the space and the work that incredible organizations are doing, and Open Society is very proud to be playing a part in that. We hope to see more commitments like the many that we heard yesterday already from different governments and other actors and corporations that are doing work to create and implement the policies that will safeguard and promote human rights. And we look forward to working together and all playing our part in collaboration. So thank you.
Good morning. I hope you all rested up and had a good evening. And welcome to day 2 of the forum. The first thing we're going to do is, yesterday was a lot. Who here thought yesterday was powerful? I mean, powerful, right? Powerful stuff, thank you. And it's difficult when, I mean, one of the reasons we're in plenary is translation, right? And so the nature of the construct makes it difficult to exchange, right? So we heard a lot yesterday that I'm sure all of us are feeling a lot, right? You hear powerful testimonies like yesterday and powerful messages, and you want to do something with it. So we're going to do something with it. I'd like you, for the next 2 minutes, to connect with someone seated near you that you don't know. And I would like you for the next 2 minutes to share with each other your thoughts on what you heard yesterday. Okay, so we want a little bit of expression. So it's not passive. I mean, turn to someone next to you, right? And share a little bit about what you heard yesterday. we're going to have a conversation, okay? So, Hélène, tell me who you are. You're a basketball athlete. And what were your thoughts about yesterday? And then... Okay. Can you hear me? There we go. Okay. Let's take our seats. I know there's a lot to talk about. 2 minutes is not enough. We'll rejoin the program in a minute. Lost control of the room, Tracy. All right, yeah. Thank you. I'm a former football player, so I would use the Ted Lasso phrase, "Oi!" Okay. All right. So, is this on? Can you guys hear? Okay, great. So, I had the chance to catch up with Hélène during the 2 minutes, or 3 minutes, or whatever it was. And I'd like to ask Hélène to share a little bit. You were here for part of yesterday. You're a basketball player, okay? And thank you for doing this in English, because your native language is French, I think, yeah, right? So, merci beaucoup. Tell me a little bit about what you heard yesterday, and also through your lens that you bring to this, which is an athlete, but also a Muslim athlete. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. I'm French, as you said, and in France there's a very peculiar context where Muslim athletes are not allowed to wear the hijab, whether they play recreational sport or professional sport. And so we are facing these barriers. And yesterday we talked about addressing the roots of discrimination and how our heritage of colonization still affects us today. And I think we have, in France, still have to address the uncomfortable truths, and we have to be uncomfortable in addressing discrimination rooted in racism, colonialism, and Islamophobia, because it's deeply linked to xenophobia and racism, and we have to recognize that this is a discrimination just like any other, and that it affects women of color, and women from a different faith.
So what's really interesting about this is that the very first Sporting Chance Forum back in 2016, we were talking about the hijab ban in basketball, and we had a wonderful athlete named Bilkis, right? You know, remember Bilkis, who's a wonderful human being. And the International Federation for Basketball overturned the ban on wearing the hijab. To their credit, that's what they did. And yet, you have a challenge today, recently, just as of what, last year? Tell me about what, I mean, that's not FIBA that's the result. That is the National Basketball Association. Tell me a little bit about that.
FIBA
and also how it impacts you.
Yeah, FIBA overturned its ban in 2017, as you said, but the French Federation and National Federation of Basketball are supposed to be sovereign and make their own laws. And so France did not overturn the ban, and it even went further, because last year, exactly a year ago, they introduced a new Article 9.3, which prohibits any equipment with religious or political connotation, but really it was supposed to target Muslim women and the hijab specifically. And so a year ago, on December 4th, I went to my game and I warmed up with my teammates, and then the referee, well, he didn't even came to me, he came to my coach and he said, she has to take her hijab off and she has to take her long sleeve t-shirt off if she wants to play. And so I ended up staying on the bench for 40 minutes. And it's not just me, it's also younger girls who faced bigotry for the first time in their life. I mean, it wasn't the first time, because I've been playing basketball since I was 5. But for some girls younger than me, it was very difficult, and they just stopped playing basketball altogether.
So the impact of this is that and this is what, I mean, Moya Dodd's here, who worked on overturning the hijab ban in the sport of football, the sport that I come from. And the net result of that policy that was, again, overturned, Prince Ali also helped with that, was that in the presence of that ban, it means that girls don't participate in sport. It's a barrier to participation. And let's be clear, it is not a safety issue. And let's also be clear that there are expressions of faith all over the place. I mean, you see this, you see the tic-tac, you see all of it, right? So singling out the hijab is a little bit hard to explain, I think, a little bit. I mean, I'm not French. Clearly you can hear by my accent. Just a few final words on sort of how do you negotiate that kind of double standard a little bit?
You can't explain it. I mean, you can, racism, Islamophobia, French context, but you just have to go through with it and have to fight it. You have to resist and say, this is not okay. We know we're singling us out. We know what you're doing, and we won't let you go ahead without fighting and without trying to find a solution to overturn this ban and really make sports accessible to all.
Okay, terrific. Well, they will be hosting the Olympic Games with athletes of all parts of the world, including athletes of Muslim faith. So more will be revealed, I think, as we get closer to Paris. But thank you very much for your voice.
Thank you.
And I wish you the best. Enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thank you very much.
So as we kick off day 2, I wanted to give a few reflections, and I'll be brief because we're a little bit off schedule, but what my deputy's looking at me, yes, Mary, we're off schedule, I get it. And I think we will probably push through the break as a result. So we'll see. But a few thoughts yesterday, and there have been a few summations, but I wanted to give you a little bit of my take. Here's what I heard yesterday. When we started, and again, remember this is a continuum, right? We started along the lines of the UN Guiding Principles, where it starts about, culture and leadership and commitment to human rights starts there. And in the panel that talked about culture and leadership, we talked about in sport there's a major trust deficit, right? We heard several times that it has to start with trust. Well, how do you build trust? And it starts with hearing from those who've been impacted. And that is what I heard over in every panel, the impact of hearing from those who are affected in a way, and we do this all the time at the center. It's not about yelling at each other and pointing fingers. It's about sitting down and truly having an exchange of what is happening, decisions that are made, policies that are implemented, how that affects people, and hearing about that from the people who've been affected, how and why. Now, I have my own lived experience. In 2017, I was tasked with writing the human rights strategy for the 2026 World Cup. Look at me, right? You hear by my accent, I come from the United States, maybe? How am I going to understand what it's like, if you're black or brown, to go through a land crossing from Mexico into the United States if you're black or brown or your passport is not blue and doesn't have an eagle on it? How would I know that? How would I know what it's like to be a journalist who is in the middle of covering a protest, peaceable protest, who is then arrested as part of other things that are happening and can't do their job? How would I know what it is like to experience reality of being black or brown in different parts of North America? I don't know what it's like to be indigenous. So, the whole point of how do I do my job then? If my job is to write a human rights strategy that addresses the reality of a situation in a continent like North America with its risks, how do you address those risks? How would I know what all those risks are? The answer is you talk to people who are affected. So the biggest takeaway I got yesterday, and the thing we're going to talk about today, is that's the road to truth. That's the road to truth. The truth starts with conversation in a way that we can communicate with each other and we can hear each other. And I used to work at FIFA 100 years ago. And I will tell you that back then, the idea of really having meaningful stakeholder engagement with people who are affected by decisions you're making was not something that my 40-year-old self understood. So my atonement for that is the job I have today, which is to help convey to you, it is difficult to do this work, but I implore you to take the journey, because it is powerful what you will learn. And we're going to hear today different examples of how when you hear from people who are affected, what it then enables you to do in decisions you take, in policies you create, and in how you treat those that you're engaging with. So for me, and there's so many different ways of that, but I won't go into it, but that was the main theme that I got out of yesterday. And so we're going to keep with that today, and we're going to end with that today. But now I'd like to turn the floor back over to Tracy to take us through our very first panel session of the morning. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Mary. And I'm interested that you worked at FIFA 100 years ago, because I interviewed you when you worked at FIFA 100 years ago, which means we're both about 140. We're looking good. Okay, so to the first session, and I'll skip through some of the other notes that we had, because I think it's really important to keep going and to maintain this mood that has already been created in the morning from the little discussions we've had with each other, and to learn about some of the challenges from people we didn't previously know. So I will go straight to our Canada project lead at the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, who is Sabrina Razak, and she's going to facilitate this next session, which is Voice, Agency and Action, engaging young journalists in communities and at mega sports events. Sabrina, over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome to the panel Nanousha Sis, Mariam Walker Khan, Monifa Mondere, and Shireen Ahmed. We had quite intense conversations backstage, one of them being what should be our walkout song, but we never did get to it. Thank you for the morning comments and reflections, and also Alain, who came and spoke. I reflected on this quote by Audre Lorde, and she writes, "We have to consciously study how to be tender with each other until it becomes a habit." And Audre Lorde is a prolific writer, and I just want us to have that quote in mind as we do this session, and also for the remainder of the conference. I'm super looking forward to engaging in a discussion with our esteemed panelists. The title of this session is called Voice, Agency, and Action, Engaging Young Journalists in Communities at Mega Sporting Events. So the speakers are going to introduce themselves, but I want to give a special welcome to Nanousha Sis and Monifa Mondere. This is the first time they have ever been asked to be on a panel. I'm not sure where you go after this, though. It's a pretty hard bar. Barack Obama gave a speech and spoke to a group of young people and claimed, "I often think about, despite what we see happening around us, I would not want to live in any other time period but this present time." He was referring to the advancements of various laws, legislations, but mostly opportunities available to young people. In this current era, we have witnessed an increasing number of media platforms accessible to young people, literally right at our fingertips, creating and producing instantaneous information. The implication for sport and human rights has resulted in exponential growth and exposure of violations, abuse, and progress. This panel will speak to the importance of voice and the necessity to carefully craft stories in the current landscape of misinformation, disinformation, legacy media, and social media. And we spoke a lot about this yesterday, about power. Who has the ability to tell our stories might arguably be the most powerful, might be more powerful than factual information or getting balanced perspective. Media research studies have proven that online content does in fact contribute to a heightened consciousness. Therefore, social media offers nuanced insights necessary to hold legacy media accountable to equitable journalistic standards and integration of equity-denied groups' perspectives. We recognize the constraints on sports journalists and what they're faced with. A New York Times correspondent remarked that one reporter, as they travel with a team, and he did a professional football team for years, and he developed a rapport with the players, team personnel, and club. Those relationships took time to cultivate, and he built a level of trust that was mutually beneficial. Exposing human rights abuses are often avoided due to the costs and risk associated with negative exposure, losing your job, and being banned from the club outright. So who does it? Two people on this panel, Shireen Ahmed, activist, multi-platform sports journalist, and senior contributor at the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, and Mariam Walker Khan, diversity and inclusion reporter at Sky Sports, are journalists who repeatedly take those risks in journalism. The sacrifice that each of these women continue to make in order to ensure we keep pushing forward, moving that rock up the hill, cannot be underscored. Being a racialized woman in sports journalism is no small feat. In Europe, US, and Canada, and westernized countries, the sports news department consists of 95% white males. In non-Western countries, the rooms are almost exclusively male. The kind of armor you have to develop, the ongoing violence you have to endure, the constant battles you have to fight, the harm perpetrated on racialized women in sport media is unacceptable, insufferable, and at times intolerable. Today, we honor you both and seek to better understand how to create more inclusive spaces and opportunities for such stories to continue and to be written and published. When the world watched the abuse of Jenni Hermoso suffered, both Shireen and Miriam rightfully published articles on the incidents, but also reminded and encouraged others to acknowledge gender discrimination and widespread sexual abuse occurring amongst racialized communities that is typically ignored by mainstream media. We thank you both for being here, your work and audacity to do what you do with such brilliance. Munifa will speak on her experiences with the Commonwealth Youth Games in the beautiful island of Trinidad and Tobago, a unique opportunity designed with the local organizing committee and UNICEF UK. Nanusha, coming from Senegal, will share about her involvement with the International Olympic Committee's Young Reporters Program. Young people's perspectives are critical and essential to engagement with sport and human rights, and we believe directly impact the work we are all trying to accomplish. Thank you to each of you for being here. Today, we encourage audience members to reflect on who has the power to report on sport and social issues. Many people in this room are quite aware of the challenges working with the media. Research suggests that one measure of success connected to social justice movement includes having your stories published by mainstream media. Amplification is vital for progress, advancement, and of course, to garner support. How can we influence media outlets to be more representative of equity-denied groups, as well as cover such topics? What can be done to ensure young journalists are prepared and inspired to develop critical dialogue around sport and human rights? Now I will turn it over to Nanusha, who will introduce herself and what experience shaped you to become interested in media.
Ok. Je suis Nanusha Assis, je viens du Sénégal. Je suis en fin d'études de journalisme au CESTI, le Centre d'études des sciences et techniques de l'information, à l'Université Cheikh Anta Diop de Dakar. Si je suis là ici devant vous ce matin, c'est parce que j'ai eu le privilège, au mois de septembre dernier, de participer à un programme très pertinent du CIO, qui s'appelle l'IAEC Young Reporters Program. J'aurai l'occasion de développer là-dessus un peu plus tard. Je pense que le thème de ce panel qui nous réunit aujourd'hui est tout à fait approprié pour libérer nos jeunes voix. Il me donne le sentiment que les voix des jeunes journalistes comme les nôtres, ici présents, comptent encore dans ce monde. S'agissant de mon intérêt pour le journalisme, il me vient directement de ma famille, plus précisément de mon oncle qui s'appelle Georges. Je me souviens qu'à mes 15 ans, il me disait souvent « Nénoucha, tu devrais envisager le journalisme comme ton futur métier ». Il trouvait que j'avais une façon particulière d'écrire les histoires. Il lisait souvent mes rédactions au collège. Dans l'une d'elles, je racontais un voyage en Amérique, alors que je n'ai jamais mis les pieds en Amérique avant. Je parlais de New York, de la Statue de la Liberté, bref, de tout ce que j'avais l'habitude de voir concernant l'Amérique à la télé. Et il trouvait que mon histoire était très originale et pleine d'imagination. Donc, il m'a vivement encouragée à embrasser cette profession. J'ai fini par développer une curiosité pour ce métier. Et je trouve que le journalisme a quelque chose de formidable quand l'éthique chevillée au corps, il participe à défendre des causes et à engager la société dans la construction d'un monde moins égoïste et plus humain. Merci beaucoup.
Monifa?
Is it on? Okay. Hi, my name is Monifa Monderoy. I always enjoyed reading from since I was a young girl. I started off in reading novels like Nancy Drew, and that's what got me interested in writing. At around 15 years old in secondary school, in Form 3, I started writing stories like the novels I would read, and my friends would all be like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Can we get another one? Can we get another one? And I would be like, oh my gosh, because I would leave them with cliffhangers. And I didn't believe that I had a talent for writing. It's only the reception I got that interested me. And then coming down to the exam that we do to enter college, I had to think seriously on a career. And I said, okay, if you like reading and writing, find a career in something that you like and you wouldn't work a day in your life. So I decided to do some research and I found journalism. First, I found publications, and then I discovered the Bachelor of Arts in Journalism. And I said, this sounds interesting. I Googled some more and found a college in Trinidad, the College of Science, Technology and Applied Arts, and they offered bachelor's in journalism. And I said, okay, things are going great. And I looked into it. I did my exam, got my passes, and proceeded to the college. I am currently in my last year doing one more semester. And I've discovered that journalism is exactly where I need to be. From the start of school, it's been the best grades I've had in my life. And I honestly quite enjoy the power that you have with a pen and being able to write and influence people's thoughts and actions. Thank you.
Try again.
They're on?
Yep.
I want to read some of those stories. They sound great. So I actually never, ever kind of wanted to be a journalist. I probably didn't see myself represented. I'm from the north of England. They don't really let northerners on the telly in the UK. But I'm also, you know, a woman of colour, and I didn't see any of those, especially not in the world of sport. But I was a sprinter growing up. I did athletics for 12, 13 years, probably about 11 years too long. And I absolutely lived and breathed track and field. It was my whole life. My brothers, even, you know, my grandparents met at a track, so it was kind of just ingrained in our family. And I was quite ill when I was younger, so I was kind of training while taking chemotherapy, and it just got to a point where I was injured all the time. And one year at uni, I was injured, my friend had set up like an athletic streaming website called Vinco Sport. So I started writing for them, and it started off, you know, interviewing friends at the Northern Championships, and then the next year it was like Usain Bolt at the Diamond League. And I think I probably didn't realise for about 3 years that I was actually doing sports journalism while at uni. And I graduated I did English, Lit and French at uni, and I graduated, and my mum was like, what are you going to do? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, well, there's like a broadcast journalism course at Sheffield University. Like, you can live at home for free with the dog. It could be quite fun. And I was like, yeah, why not? So I did that and absolutely just fell in love with everything I was learning. It was so practical. It was so interesting. And I kind of felt like finally I'd found something that I could use all the skills for that I'd been using over the past few years. So I did that, and then I got into the BBC's journalism trainee scheme, which again, like, was totally unexpected. I was really calm on the day of the interview because I was like, there's no way, because there's like 5,000 people applying. I was like, oh, this is just a day out. And then got the call and like burst into tears when I found out, and worked at BBC Sport for 6 years after that. And I think it was there that I kind of developed an interest, not really on purpose, just an interest in representing communities that don't really have their stories told, and representing like voiceless people essentially, because I had already this passion for learning about race in particular. I did my dissertation on the civil rights movement, and so bringing that all together was just a dream that I didn't really know I had. And I actually tried to pitch the job of diversity and inclusion reporter. They didn't want me to do that, but then it popped up at Sky Sports News, and now I'm there. So yeah, I'm very grateful to be in this role, and just even to be here is crazy, so yeah.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to clarify that this is a young journalist panel, so I'm here as a token representative. I'm honored to be here because listening to youth who are journalists and storytellers and creatives helps us unlearn, who are the older generation within media. And along this entire forum, we've heard from athletes and advocates and those decision makers, stakeholders and you know, large players. But storytelling and the chronicling of what happens is equally as important and has a big part in this. So I'm really honored to be here. I've learned a lot from these three. And I'm a multi-platform senior contributor at CBC Sports, but I also am a professor of journalism and sports journalism in particular. So I find it really enlightening to be here amongst them. And I mean, my journey into this, particularly as we were talking, unlike Nanusha, whose family encouraged her to be a journalist, my family was like, absolutely do not go into media. I did exactly that. I have a talent of not listening. And I'm happy I'm here because the newsrooms that I am in do not look like me at all. They are, as Dr. Razak said, they are 95% able-bodied cishet men, white men in particular, and that's not me. So, but that doesn't mean that a space isn't carved out. And the reason race is really important in this, and I'm so appreciative because the panels that I have been sat on do not look like this. So this is incredibly cathartic to be sat along these brilliant young women. Who tells the story is as important as what the story is. And the lenses from which those stories are told is also important. So, I mean, my foray into this industry, essentially I came into the industry because I didn't like the way the stories of racialized women and Muslim women in particular were being told. I didn't like it. So I decided to do it myself. Much of my graduate school, I mean, it's not as if I don't have training, but very much journalism, you learn a lot of what you do in the field. And that's something that I think journalists can agree on. Some of the most brilliant investigative or reporters and opinion columnists actually didn't go to journalism school. My background is in gender studies and political science. But I find myself in this space and very appreciative to be here. My lens is very much on race and gender and those intersections in sport and issues of justice as they pertain to sport in whatever form they come. Again, it's a very dynamic industry, and one of the things that I love the most about it is being able to pivot and using TikTok and Instagram and different platforms of storytelling are ones that should not be poo-pooed. They should be embraced and encouraged, but there is definitely a process by which ethically and with harm reduction, journalism should be done. And we talk about survivors a lot and athletes. Anti-oppression in storytelling and in journalism is not a new fad. It is something that marginalized communities have been saying for a very long time. Their voices just aren't simply amplified. And this is also pertains to newsrooms. And I'll just leave you with one thing as we start this important conversation. One of my favorite thinkers, Arundhati Roy, is an Indian feminist, and she says there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. So just sit with that for a second as we continue.
Thank you so much. So I'd like it to turn it over to Miriam. If you can walk us through the process of pitching a story and the challenges of getting a piece published. And I know everyone on this panel here has varying degrees of experience. So can you speak to a time when you were a freelance journalist versus connected to a network, and how you think the process could be improved?
So as a freelance journalist, I think it's really hard if you're not connected to a network to pitch stories. I think unless you have built up a reputation, especially when you're young, it's really hard to kind of get people to trust you. So I was kind of working at BBC Sport while I was freelance, doing like 10 days a month or whatever. And even I still struggled, even though I was meant to be doing 10 days a month, pitching stories, I think is really difficult because if you work on stories that are outside of the usual day-to-day kind of football, sporting news, people don't really always see why those stories matter. So I think a good example of this is I literally waited like 5 years to pitch this. It was a documentary on the anniversary of Bend It Like Beckham, which is, as we all know, the best film in the world. And I was like waiting for 2021, when was it out? 2022, 21? Yeah, last year. And no one was really like listening to me, even though I was getting paid to work 10 days at the BBC. No one was really, I guess, understanding why it was important. And I was like, guys, you don't have to just be a brown woman to love this film. It talks about sexuality, it talks about gender, it talks about coach abuse, essentially. And it's so important in this day and age to kind of reflect on that and see how far we actually haven't really come in women's football. So no one actually commissioned it, and then I just went and made it in my 10 days. Got my friend to film it for free. Got friends who were the best voices and world experts like Shireen to be interviewed for it. And that documentary, even though it was only meant to go on like the news channel, BBC News channel, for about 3 or 4 minutes, ended up going on BBC One 2 days in a row at 30-minute segments, BBC Three, every outlet in like radio picked it up. Articles were written about it, which had never happened to me before. And I think what was really important in that pitching process is that I kind of ignored everyone because I knew that it would do well and that these are the stories that need to be told, and we need to sometimes step back and reflect on things like the past 20 years. But I think that just goes to show, like, you can pitch an idea to one person, and if they don't really connect with it, it's really difficult. So now at Sky Sports News, I know we have a system where it's called the Ideas Factory, and people can pitch things to more than one people, and people can kind of like talk about ideas and not just be told no. Because I think, especially when you're young, like you face so much rejection with your pitches, and you have to get used to that. But equally, sometimes like people are wrong about what will fly and what won't.
Thank you. Shireen.
So if you asked me in 2012 what I did for a living, I would tell you that I wrote pitches and got rejected. That was my profession. Particularly the pitches that I was interested in were on, like I said, intersections of race. And I think it would be necessary to punctuate what I'm saying by reminding folks that in 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, there was a huge shift in media because newsrooms in the West in particular woke up to realize they were completely unequipped to handle the discussions that were happening and needed to happen. And I believe in sports as a connector of people, but also as a vehicle for extremely urgent conversations in society. And some of the most profound conversations at that moment in the world were done through sport and sports journalism. So before that, it wasn't really happening. And we're far beyond this idea that sports shouldn't be political. We are far beyond. I don't need to say that to this room. Indeed, they are. And the way that then there was a bit of a panic. My phone didn't stop ringing. I mean, I'm, happily overemployed at the moment, whereas it wasn't so hard. I was independent and freelance for my entire career until I found out, docked my ship at CBC Sports. And I think pitching, there's a reluctance. I come from, historically, I'm Pakistani, and I have citizenship there as well. But I was born and raised in Canada, and the conversations around gender or race or homophobia or anti-Semitism or trans athletes in particular make people extremely uncomfortable. And it's not a discomfort that people like to sit with. There's a lack of knowledge in a lot of places. There's a refusal to use basic toolkits to speak of things like survivors of violence in sport. I don't understand why these accessible toolkits, some done by Athlete Ally or some done by different organizations that are free to Sports Desk, they're not used. It helps with language. And language is essential in any industry, but it's particularly critical in ours. So, I mean, I'm at a point now where I just have an editorial meeting with my editor, and to be very frank with you, who I upset or who gets flustered by what I write is not a concern for me anymore. And that matters. And when we look to young journalists, as Mim said, they are often overlooked, and racialized women in particular, or queer women, or disabled women, or anyone in those margins, they are completely overlooked in their voices, but their ideas are routinely stolen. So I think that's something else that we need to look at, who are generating the ideas. And if you're in a room, please think about who's not there, and if you have any capacity editorially, look at who's not there and bring them in and listen.
Thank you. We'll turn it over to Munifa. Carving a space for young journalists is often challenging. Getting into the industry requires connections, education, access to opportunity, and a little bit of luck. Munifa, can you speak to the kind of work you're involved in and the reception to your stories and perspectives?
So Trinidad and Tobago is a little off the coast of Venezuela, and we're really small on the global map. We're currently a dot. But because we're so small, our population is also small. If I'm, don't quote me, I think it's about 3 million people, I believe. Because we're so small, our media tends to be mixed. We dabble in everything. Our journalists don't have any specific sectors, so you might find sports journalists definitely barred off, but business, news, tourism and everything is mixed. So currently I am in an internship with the tourism sector. I am able to go out to recently we had a cruise season opening. I was able to attend the season opening and meet with the tourists that came in, and we had this whole cultural fest for them when they come off the ship and all of these things. As well as recently in June, July, August, I was offered the opportunity by my advisor. He gave me a call and said that the UNICEF UK and Trinbago 2023 wanted volunteers to cover content for social media for Safe Sports Day. And I was excitedly agreeing to go ahead and collect information, because as a young journalist, I tend to take every opportunity that I could get. I was glad to hear that they needed young journalists, and I said, yes, sign me up instantly. I took time off from work, and I went, and we interviewed about 15 to 20 youth athletes in the games. Our job was to receive content containing safe sport, because it was for Safe Sports Day. So we went around asking safeguarding officials and the young athletes themselves about their human rights and their rights in sport and the general knowledge on if they understood what it meant. And the feedback we received was amazing. We did interviews. However, we tended not to stick to only serious questions because of the age. So we decided to involve fun questions like this or that. What was their favorite post-practice meal, pre-practice meal? It was really exciting to see how excited they were to be in a new country. And the feedback that we got from the questions was excellent. It was amazing. Overall, the general reception was that everyone understood their rights, and that was an amazing thing to see from such young athletes. And, going into the games, I myself had to do some research because so young into the game, I was like, human rights and sport, okay, this is a big topic. And I was glad that we were doing content on it because not everyone is aware that it's such a big topic. So I was glad to be able to help share that information with UNICEF UK and Trinbago 2023. Thank you.
Thank you. Nanusha.
Pour ma part, deux choses m'ont permis d'acquérir de l'expérience dans le milieu du journalisme. La première a été mon stage l'année dernière au quotidien national Le Soleil. Je couvrais des activités culturelles et mes productions plaisaient à la rédaction. Et la deuxième chose qui m'a plus marquée, la deuxième expérience a été avec l'ISU Young Reporter Programme. Je l'ai démarré, excusez-moi. La deuxième chose a été l'expérience avec l'ISU Young Reporter Programme. J'ai découvert ce programme grâce à mon directeur d'école de journalisme qui m'a un jour invité dans son bureau pour en parler. Au début, je n'étais pas très sûre de postuler pour ce programme car à ce moment-là, j'étais en pleine préparation de mon mémoire de fin d'études de journaliste. Mais grâce aux explications et aux encouragements de mon directeur, j'ai fini par me lancer. J'ai envoyé une lettre de motivation d'une page aux concernés. Quelques semaines plus tard, j'ai reçu une réponse favorable du CIO. Ma candidature a été retenue. J'ai ensuite dû monter un dossier de demande de visa pour la France. C'est ainsi que je me suis retrouvée à Paris en septembre dernier à couvrir un test event de mountain biking, vélo de montagne, à la colline d'Elancourt. Pendant 4 jours, j'étais avec, 8 des 16 jeunes journalistes africains sélectionnés pour ce programme. Les autres n'ont malheureusement pas pu nous rejoindre sur place à cause de problèmes de visa. Donc pendant 4 jours, nous avons été mentorés par une équipe de 6 journalistes qui ont blanchi sous le harnais, comme Tracy Holmes, qui est là devant moi, de l'Australie. Nous avons produit des photos, des vidéos et des articles. C'était 4 jours de travail très intense, un peu trop court pour moi pour profiter suffisamment de l'expérience de chacun de nos mentors. Cependant, j'ai beaucoup aimé. Les mentors étaient de bons conseils et très ouverts à nos idées. Et ils appréciaient nos productions, ce qui était très encourageant pour moi. Je trouve que je ne regrette pas d'avoir participé à ce programme, car ça m'a permis, quelques semaines plus tard, c'est-à-dire juste le mois de novembre dernier, de participer au festival Dakar en jeu. J'ai pu travailler avec une équipe en charge du site officiel du CIO, Olympics.com, dans la couverture du festival, qui est un festival culturel et sportif, organisé chaque année depuis 2022, en préparation des futurs Jeux olympiques de la jeunesse Dakar 2026. J'ai couvert la cérémonie d'ouverture du festival. J'ai aussi écrit un article sur les danseurs sénégalais. J'ai pu les rencontrer en coulisses avant leur entrée en scène. C'était formidable. Mes productions ont été publiées sur le site officiel Dakar 2026. Cela m'a fait énormément plaisir et a beaucoup plu à mon oncle Georges, que je salue. Alors, merci.
Thank you. Miriam, I'll turn it over to you. And both you and Shireen talked about this, about sports media resisting investigative pieces or writing about social issues in sport. Other sections will typically report on exposing human rights issues. While recognizing the shortfalls and constraints of legacy media to address human rights in sports, how has sports, and I put sports in brackets, media evolved over time to be more aware and accountable to report on such issues?
A few years ago, I was working on a story for kind of months, just in the background, about the lack of diversity in women's football in the UK, ethnic diversity, and a squad was released basically where every player was white, which, if you compare to the men's team, is obviously a big issue. And I was talking to a press officer one day, and she was really angry that I was covering the story. She said I was annoying people, ruffling feathers, because no one had reported on it at that time, which to me was crazy. But I think if you look at the landscape a few years ago of women's football reporters, that there weren't any women of colour, and people just weren't talking about it for some reason. So a press officer told me that I couldn't work on the story because I was not white and I wasn't impartial enough. So I actually started like crying. I was like, oh my God, what is this industry? Like, why am I here? What am I doing? And I sat after that phone call for a few hours thinking, what other jobs can I do? Like, I'd got into this really cool job at BBC Sport, and then I just questioned everything. So a friend actually told me to chat to someone on the internet who I've followed on Twitter for years and was a huge advocate for women of colour in the industry. So I messaged them and said, can we have a Zoom call? She pep talked me for about an hour, and then I went to eat Popeyes with her in Canada, and now we're sat on a panel at the United Nations together. So I think it's really difficult when you're, especially the first one to tell those stories, because now it's kind of trendy to talk about the lack of diversity in women's football, which is amazing, like it should be. But when you're the first one, it's very isolating. And it obviously takes one person to do it for other people to be like, oh yeah, we should have probably covered that like 10 years ago. But I think things have changed because now people are talking about it. People aren't afraid to challenge governing bodies in the UK to talk about why this is an issue, why it is getting worse and worse. And I think it's just a good example of how things have shifted and how a lot of the time, like one person with a support system can change things like that. And I genuinely would not have been able to do that without the support system of mentors, new people I met who'd done it in other countries, even just my mum listening to me. I think it's such a weird industry, and you just need the backing of all those people. And young journalists who get into the industry always ask, like, what is your number one tip? And always it is just to collect mentors. Don't have one, have a mentor for each different thing that you are struggling with or you think you need advice on. I have about 30 at this point. I've got like 3 football teams worth. So yeah, just collect them and keep learning from people. Because even, you know, I hope that in 20 years, if I'm still doing this job, I will keep learning from different people, especially younger people.
Thank you.
So how sports media has advanced in different ways is really, really wonderful to see the changes in my lifetime of the conversation topics that happen. I think that Miriam touched on something really important, which is networking and community. And I say community in more particular ways because if you're a woman in media anywhere in the world and in sports media, there is a whisper network. If there are predators in the newsrooms that you work with, you have a WhatsApp group and you notify people. This happened to me just 2 weeks ago. I was notified of 2 particular individuals that would be where I was, and I spread that information, and this happens. This is how women protect themselves in many industries, not just in journalism. And I think it sounds like it's shocking what I'm saying, but there's one thing that we know is that to do our jobs is not just our jobs, it's to survive barriers and challenges. So that I found incredibly helpful. I can't emphasize enough the mentorship. I have mentors as well, probably about 5 football teams at this point. But that's the other thing of taking out the ego and being happy to unlearn what might have been implemented before. one of the things that I think is important is that the willingness for people to unlearn and relearn and implement those, anti-oppressive approaches and practices in journalism and in media is really important. And on the objectivity, I've been told many times that I can't write about issues of, racialized issues. Currently in Canada, there's not one single Indigenous full-time sports reporter. That's a huge problem. And it's for a variety of things. It's not the most stable of industries. I mean, sometimes I wonder why I don't just open a cat cafe. I'm done. Every couple of weeks, I'm telling my husband, okay, this is it, I'm done. He's like, no, you're not. We go through the same conversation again. Because the pressures and the stresses, there's multitudes of them, but also I believe so deeply in the importance of reporting. And Canada is a place where our national sports organizations, like many other countries, have faced crises of abuse. And this is because of incredible reporting. My colleague Rick Westhead, who works at TSN, broke a story about the Chicago NHL team, and abuse in that, has been covering that. My friend Meg Linehan, who writes for The Athletic in the United States, broke a story about abuse in football that rippled throughout the world. So reporting and journalism has a very important place in the sports world. And I'm not out here to make friends with people in high places. That's literally not what I'm here for. I'm here to chronicle ethically what's been happening and amplify voices that unfortunately don't get that amplification, whether there's subjects that are not considered important enough, and many of those, as I mentioned, are from marginalized communities. Those are huge pieces of sports history that need to be told, and those stories need to be told. And being told no, I've cried in many WhatsApp chat groups before, and I'm sure it'll continue to happen. But that's, I'm not going to say just get thicker skin. At the same time, I'm interested and also drawing attention to my own industry. And if you are in or journalists, ask them what their colleagues, what the makeup looks like of their newsrooms and how open they are to hearing people. And if those journalists in those places are silenced in any capacity, that's what is very important in media as well. But sports has a right to play with that. Accountability is a thing. That could be a whole other panel, quite frankly. But that's important. So for us telling the stories and working with sports organizations as well to get the comments. I mean, people have attempted to ignore me. My emails often go unread. But, I'm relentless, and that's a helpful characteristic.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Nanusha, I'll turn it over to you. What areas of human rights in sport do you believe should receive more attention in the media, and why do you think it's being underreported?
Je pense qu'il existe un racisme environnemental dont on ne parle pas assez dans les médias et qui impacte terriblement le bien-être des Africains et transforme petit à petit notre continent en poubelle. Les déchets des pays occidentaux viennent polluer nos terres. Par exemple, les pays du Nord profitent de la pauvreté des Africains et du manque de ressources économiques et juridiques de nos États pour refiler, par exemple, des batteries usagées au Nigeria ou vendre à des prix dérisoires quelque chose comme 800 millions d'articles de seconde main à un pays comme le Ghana qui compte à peine 40 millions d'habitants. Terrible. Et puis, comme nous le savons tous ici, l'Afrique est le continent le plus impacté par le réchauffement climatique. Pourtant, le continent n'émet que 9% d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre, contre 45% dans les pays développés. Et malgré cela, l'Afrique étouffe sous la canicule. La température augmente chaque année sur le continent de 1,4 degrés Celsius par an, contre 1% dans le reste du monde. Ces vagues de chaleur et additionnées à la concentration de la pollution atmosphérique compromettent terriblement le niveau de performance et de bien-être des athlètes africains. On peut prendre pour exemple les athlètes de semi-marathon. Et c'est dommage. Surtout, j'ajouterais aussi que le changement climatique impacte aussi le milieu du sport dans le cas des organisations des événements sportifs qui a envie de faire du sport dans un environnement où l'air est vicié et où la chaleur est mortelle? Personne. Qui a envie d'aller dans un stade, assister à un match, alors que la chaleur est étouffante, on ne peut pas respirer? Personne. À la fin, le sport ne devient pas une priorité pour les Africains. Ils sont plus souciés par autre chose. Et c'est dommage. Heureusement, le milieu sportif ne reste pas passif face à cette catastrophe climatique. Des initiatives sont prises un peu partout en Afrique et dans le reste du monde. Je citerai par exemple le projet Sport Planète, initié en 2017 à Brazzaville. C'est une initiative qui lie le sport et l'environnement. Elle consiste à organiser des matchs de football pour ensuite reverser les recettes du spectacle sportif à des associations de lutte pour la protection du climat et la préservation de la biodiversité. Et je pense que ce genre d'initiative devrait se multiplier de plus en plus pour au moins changer les choses, limiter la catastrophe au moins. Merci.
Thank you. Miriam.
I mean, everything you just said, first of all. But also, I think something that gets really neglected in the sports media is transgender rights and trans people in sport. I think, to be honest, I think people are scared about writing about it, talking about it, working on it because people don't know enough. And I once actually was asked to write an article about a trans athlete and said no because I don't know enough. But if that was anything else, you know, as journalists, you're taught that you have to learn about loads of different things and you should become an expert on something for a day or 2 days, whatever. So I don't think it's an excuse, and since then I have written pieces, but I think people are genuinely worried because there's so much vitriol and it's been blown into this huge issue that people are so passionate about. I also think we hear a lot from people who do not know anything about it, don't really actually know, you know, what it's like to be a person who is trans. I think we hear so much from people who would want to protect women's sports, or they say they want to protect women's sports and don't actually listen to trans people who are living those experiences. So I think there's this weird kind of debate about like balance in these issues that we never get right. I think we hear too much from people who don't actually know much about it in general. So yeah, I think we can do so much better as an industry just listening to people and listening to their experiences before getting someone on to just spout hate for an hour.
Thank you. Shireen?
And just to punctuate what both of them had said, I totally agree with those topics in terms of needing more nuanced coverage. You could argue there's a lot of coverage about trans athletes, but it's not particularly nuanced. I think one of the things for me, one of the stories that I find the most problematic in the current space is and we heard from Hélène earlier, is the fact that Muslim athletes can't choose to wear hijab in France. We're in an Olympic year, and I find this so mind-blowing that this allows to continue. And what I'm saying could be fairly unpopular, but that's not a me problem. The reality is when you prevent youth and athletes from accessing sport because of their choice to cover or wear clothes in whichever way they want, that's policing of women's bodies, and it's denying them agency. And the choice of how to dress should rest, as long as it adheres to rules of safety, which it doesn't, you defy those. We all know that. IFAB has a whole report on it. This is just incredible to me. By projecting really anti-Muslim and Islamophobic rhetoric onto those women, I am still stunned and probably heartbroken by the fact that French athletes have been told that women athletes who want to cover, that they cannot and participate. I don't understand whether it's acceptable to anybody. So if you're about to have a conversation with anyone from any Olympic committee, and the other problem is people are like, well, this isn't an us problem. This is a French issue. Well, then how are we pretending to network and be community? If you are in any Olympic committee, you should have a conversation or send an email or in your WhatsApp or Signal group and say, this is not okay. I think what happens is people feel it's not a them problem. You're either interested in human rights or you're not. There's no caveats. There's no quid pro quos. Either you profess to care about people, and that includes racialized Muslim women, or you don't. So if you do, please stand up and literally do something about it instead of shying away from an issue. If you are not Muslim or not French, it doesn't matter. You can say something. If you're not trans, you can say something. If you're not someone who knows a lot about biodiversity or climate change, you can say something. And more people need to be doing this in these spaces. I mean, I have been literally yelling about this for a long time, because we see it recreated in different times in different ways. But again, and it's not just this issue, I see tentativity too much from people with too much power that should not be tentative.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to make sure we get time for some questions. There's some really great questions. So Monifa, I want to turn it to you and ask you, what would you like this audience to hear about why young voices should be engaged in reporting sporting events and covering human rights? And how can the media safely engage young people in these important conversations, covering the stories and being included in stories that impact their lives and communities?
So definitely, first thing I would say is young people bring a new perspective. With the world developing so quickly these days, young people are able to bring a perspective, no offense, that the older generation may not be able to. The youths coming up in athletics, as well as on a whole in the general society, are wildly advanced. They do and say things even I myself do not understand, like Gen Z, Gen X. I do not know which one I belong in. I do not know what differentiates them. However, given that, we probably still have a bit more understanding than an older reporter may have, and we would be able to bring a fresh perspective to a story rather than just say what we believe everyone should know. So, for instance, if it is per se, like the Commonwealth Games, we were able to ask them questions about their rights in a way that wasn't activist feeling. So it was just like concern, like if they understood what was going on, and then they were open about it. And we were able to soften the blow with fun questions, whether this or that, and things like this. For instance, one of the questions I asked a lot of them would be, for the females, heels or sneakers? One person said sneakers, it's athletes. So it was a great experience for youth journalists to be able to interact with youth athletes and be able to bridge the gap and understand where they're coming from. And I feel like they were more open because I was so much closer to their age. So we bring a new perspective and comfort into an interview, and we would be better to understand the perspective that they want to give, as well as when we're writing the article, we could write the article from a perspective that a younger person may understand and be able to feel and concern with, and be able to get the message of human rights and sporting out there easier and a lot less activists. Thank you.
Thank you. Nanusha.
L'introduction des droits humains dans le domaine du sport s'inscrit sans nul doute dans un processus de rationalisation et de responsabilisation du milieu sportif. Il s'agit là de dire aux jeunes que le sport n'est pas qu'un simple divertissement qui fait parler le cœur et les tripes, mais que c'est aussi un terrain de lutte et d'engagement pour les droits humains constamment violés et menacés dans le monde. Il s'agit aussi de les faire comprendre que les droits humains, c'est comme la démocratie, ce ne sont pas des acquis. Il faut se battre, c'est un combat perpétuel contre les forces du mal. Les jeunes sont les futurs protecteurs des droits humains. Ils n'ont donc pas le droit d'être passifs. Maintenant, comment leur faire comprendre que c'est important, que les droits humains dans le domaine du sport, c'est important? Il serait intéressant de leur faire savoir que le sport n'est pas qu'un simple jeu. Le sport, c'est aussi ce qui se passe avant, pendant et après le sport. Ce sont les enjeux, les conditions dans lesquelles l'événement sportif a été organisé, et les droits humains qui ont été à un moment donné respectés ou négligés avant, pendant ou après l'activité sportive. Donc, il s'agirait de les faire comprendre ça depuis le début. Et un programme comme l'Ice Young Reporter Programme est tout à fait intéressant comme initiative à améliorer, à exploiter et à financer sérieusement et à développer un peu partout dans le monde. Parce que cela permet aux jeunes, cela incite les jeunes à prendre des initiatives, à partager leurs expériences positives ou négatives dans le domaine du sport et à aussi pouvoir s'exprimer, observer le monde qui les entoure, l'analyser pour plus tard apporter leur contribution au changement. Et je voudrais ajouter, avant de terminer, que les avis des jeunes sur la marche du monde comptent. On ne leur dit pas assez, et c'est bien dommage, surtout en Afrique, on ne leur dit pas assez. Et pourtant, il serait important qu'ils le sachent. Et il faudrait aussi éviter, cesser d'infantiliser leurs propos. Il faudrait qu'ils sachent que leurs avis comptent, il faudrait les mettre à l'aise par rapport à ça et les écouter plus souvent. Merci.
Well said. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions now. And the first one I'm going to start with. The culture of sports starts with children's experiences at grassroots level. How can we provide opportunities for children to tell their own stories of sport? And Shireen, I'm wondering if you can answer this question.
There has been this incredible movement in the last 8 to 10 years of athletes advocating for themselves and using social media platforms. I think with the right supports, children can do that as well, and they can learn proper language, they can learn the process by which storytelling is so impactful. I think this is a great idea. I know that CBC network has an off branch called CBC Kids. So the language used is one that's comprehensible to younger audiences, but they also address things in a really important way and encouraging people to take up, to amplify their own voices is really, really powerful, and we can never start too young. I mean, we encourage babies to talk and to express themselves, and then very soon after we're like, okay, sit down, don't say anything. It's a very bizarre concept. So encouraging them to get into storytelling in whatever social media platform, whatever they want, I think can be a really wonderful thing.
Thank you. Miriam, this question says, thank you for your inspiring work. Critical journalism is threatened these years. How can independent journalism stay alive and relevant in the world of sport?
I think get online. I think now it's so important, especially when engaging with younger audiences, which so many platforms and media organizations are obsessed with at the moment. It's so important to get on TikTok, Instagram, create vertical videos, start learning how to tell news stories in vertical formats, because if you're not doing that, no one is going to see your work, really. I think that's like the most crucial thing. And also, anyone can do that, right? I think we're coming into this new era where we're seeing creators tell their own stories, and like Shireen said, athletes, but also anyone can pick up their phone if they have a phone and just film themselves and tell a story. So I think, yeah, that's probably crucial.
Thank you. I'm going to actually, we are running out of time, I'm aware of that. I'm actually going to read an excerpt from one of Shireen's students. And the reason that I'm going to read that, because I think that there's so much power in representation, but there's power in representation who are also doing critical work and disrupting the narrative. So Shireen, do I have your permission? Okay, great. So one of her students wrote her after taking her class, and this is an excerpt from what she said. I look up to you in more ways than one, but there is one in particular that means a lot to me. It's the way you represent Muslims, and especially those that wear the hijab. Going into journalism, my parents always wondered where there was room for hijab in the industry. Who's going to let them on TV? They were cynical, but at the same time, they worried for their daughter. That is, until they saw other hijabis in the space, such as yourself. I saw some of your work with the CBC, and I was in awe of everything that you do. I even told my parents about you, and they were so happy to see a successful hijab in the industry. As we close, each of the panelists offered their perspectives and their challenges and opportunities. So I want to truly thank you for everyone here being on the panel and the audience for their critical questions. And as we end, I also wanted to disclose that we are launching, the Center for Sport and Human Rights is launching a young journalist program. And we are going to be offering up 40 spaces for young journalists, 13 to 18 years old, to gain experience, to learn about sport and human rights, and develop the skills for them to be successful in the industry. So we are looking to get partners and anyone who's interested in becoming involved in this program as mentors, as part of this community. Please speak to us afterwards, and hopefully we can continue to ensure that our young people are represented and have an opportunity and access to the media. Thank you so much.
Sabrina, thank you so much, and thank you very much to the panel for those insights. I've just been asked to fill for a second. Okay. I didn't wear my tap shoes today, so I won't be doing that. I'm an Aussie, which means I have a monotone voice, so I won't be singing, but I will continue filling for the time being. I just want to make some comments on, some reflections on what we heard from the panel today and how important it is in the world of media. I was wondering at the start of the morning about how many sports bodies are not here, because the very things that you've been talking about, human rights and how important they are, and we keep putting these policies into place in all of our institutions, and yet there are plenty of sports bodies who profess a commitment to human rights who have not shown up in the room today. But this panel has brought into particular focus the role of the media in telling those sorts of stories. How many people in the room today are representative of media organisations? Can you just raise your hand? See how I said raise your hand? I was about right, because there's really not that many, is there? And yet, we are supposedly the guardians of reflecting society back to itself and making a difference and giving voices to those that are underrepresented and or unrepresented in the case of some. So we've still got a very, very long way to go. So these incredible women do amazing jobs. I've been aware of all of them for a very long time, Shireen particularly because she's older than the rest, as she pointed out. But the young ones coming through are really showing a way of going forward that we haven't seen in the past. So putting up examples like this and having, programs like this, Young Reporters program, like the one that the IOC does as well. There's another one from the International Sports Press Association. Suddenly, there are voices and profiles from people that we don't normally see in the media, telling stories of so many other people in the world. If you can help out, if you can partner with these sorts of programs, please make yourself known to either the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, the IOC, any other organisation that has Young Reporter programs going, because we can see how important they are, how successful they are, and what incredible young women there are that can tell these stories around the world, and young men. We should point that out as well. Thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you. Okay, now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Kat Craig, who's Special Advisor for the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, who is going to moderate our next panel on responding to and remedying abuse in sport, conducting safe, effective and appropriate investigations. Kat.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, friends and colleagues. I seem to be missing my panel, so if anybody would like to give them a shout backstage, that would be helpful. In the meantime, it is my absolute privilege, here they are, do come onto the stage. It's my absolute privilege, as we start to approach the finish line of this phenomenal conference, to tackle the topic of remedy. What do we do as a community when our protection and prevention mechanisms fail? What do we do when intentional harm is inflicted on those often at the very heart of our community? And what do we do when no one spoke up, when they failed to offer protection? As Mary Harvey said in her opening yesterday, it's a topic that many in sport have really struggled with. And I understand that. I understand it can be daunting. I have worked with hundreds of victims and survivors of abuse in different sporting disciplines across different continents, and I can tell you that seeing their pain is heartbreaking. I understand that if you're a sports body, it's daunting to think about how you may act when that harm has occurred on your watch. I understand that it's difficult when you recognize that sometimes irreparable harm has been caused. Now, I persevere because I draw courage from those very victims and survivors who are committed to the truth, to finding solutions, and who have this incredible ability to find hope even in the darkest places. Now, my panel today is tasked with proving a single but I think critically important point, and that is that hope of victims and survivors is well-founded, and that we can make huge progress in delivering effective remedy as long as we work together. I'm going to ask you today to match their courage and to match their hope as we spend some time together in the next hour. Now, before I hand over to them, I'm going to encourage you just to review their profiles. They are amazing. You can find them on the website. And I'm going to frame this next session a little because it's a very big topic. We have a very small amount of time. So I want to suggest some propositions to give some context and some thematic scope. And the first proposition that I will make is that sport is a high-risk environment. Sport creates power differentials that sadly have been proven again and again to be exploited. And there is perhaps no more pressing issue that sport faces at the moment than the issue of sexual, physical, and emotional psychological abuse that occurs in sport. So that's the context within which we're going to be looking at remedy today. We know that many have been harmed. We know that because of the courageous voices of victims and survivors. And as Stan Grant said yesterday, you cannot have reconciliation without reckoning. And I would add to that, you cannot have remedy in sport if sports bodies are not able to recognize the harm that has been caused and demonstrate the willingness to bear witness to the suffering that has resulted. Again, I remind you, let's be courageous together. My second proposition is that the majority of people in sport are good. And I say this having gone toe-to-toe with many federations, international and national. Yes, there is a problematic culture. There is a culture of medals over people, a win-at-all-cost mentality, and a mistaken belief that achieving sporting excellence sometimes requires us to look the other way. And there's a governance issue, a big governance issue. But in all the years that I've worked in sport, I've never encountered a sports leader who wanted abuse to occur. I've encountered plenty who are willing to preserve unsafe systems, systems that lack diversity, that lack transparency, that lack accountability, and lack good governance, because those are exactly the hallmarks that enable them to continue unchecked and unchallenged in their position of power. But overall, people are good, and people in sport are good. They love sport, they want to work in sports bodies, but they may not have come into sports bodies to work on issues of abuse. As I say, it's a challenging topic. And I've seen systems that simply aren't fit for purpose. Systems that were designed to tackle match fixing, that was designed to tackle doping. I've seen personnel that were not equipped with the skills and the expertise to live up to these lofty promises of sports leaders. So we see staff that are being asked to conduct trauma-informed investigations, to be survivor-centered, but who are never upskilled to understand what that means in the day-to-day practice of their work. And I know that to be true because lots of sports bodies have been courageous enough to tell us that. And that's why the Centre for Sport and Human Rights launched the Roadmap to Remedy project. It is a research and good practice initiative that has been shaped by and implemented with the support of victims and survivors. I want to thank Dr. Daniela Hirt and William Rook from the Centre here, who have been incredible supporters of this project. And many of the victims and survivors who have supported are here today or are tuned in. I would recommend that you look at the website, find the resources there, and as we go through today, I'll also explain to you some of the programs and trainings that Daniela and I have designed that you can access to try and take those learnings with you. And I want to express my deepest, deepest gratitude to all of the victim survivors and whistleblowers who worked with us. I want to thank you for your trust, your incredible expertise, and your patience. And I know it costs you all a lot, and I'm so thankful for your time. And then my third and final proposition is that solutions require input from those very people at the heart of the system who have been most affected. Abuse thrives on secrecy, on deception and isolation, and the antidote is transparency, clarity, and collaboration. That means that when harm comes to sports attention, we must act promptly to initiate investigations and inquiries and to shine a bright light to understand what has happened, how it was able to occur despite safeguards being in place, and how it can be fixed. And when we ask people to engage, whether that be in investigations, reporting abuse, helping us find others who may be able to gather evidence, when we ask them to help us build and find solutions, we have to recognize that we risk harming them again. We heard yesterday of people who were ostracized, excluded, blackballed. I've experienced with people who've had to place themselves and their families at risk, flee their homes, people who have to do all the emotional labor of trying to persuade sports bodies and others to hear them, and then face gaslighting, who are asked to perform trauma over and over again so that we can finally be persuaded to do more. So we should invite them in, but we must acknowledge and share the cost of that. Now, let's talk solutions. No pressure, guys. I'm going to remind you to use your Slido app, and Daniela, I think, is going to pass questions as they come in so that we can fold them in. But I'll start off with question one, and I'll join you on the panel. Miles, I think I might start with you, if that's okay. Can you share with us perhaps some immediate problems that you've encountered in the investigatory system as a former athlete, as someone who has sat on panels, that you think we should urgently tackle?
Well, I think the effectiveness of investigations into abuse ultimately depend on the safe engagement of affected persons. And for me, one of the main factors that can prevent that engagement is the basic lack of trust from the perspective of affected persons. And that's a lack of trust stemming from uncertainty of the process and the inherent imbalance of powers that's been talked about, throughout this conference so far. And I'm mainly talking about situations where athletes are the affected persons, so quite similar focus to the roadmap to remedy. And as a general point, and speaking, from my own experience as an athlete, and now on with a different hat on, sitting on disciplinary panels, I would say that for athletes, really the formality and potential implications of any of these processes, be they investigations, disciplinaries, or other processes, they're already daunting, they're already unfamiliar, they're already uncomfortable. And you're always acutely aware as an athlete of how short your career is and how you've got this limited sort of window to capitalize on your talent. So when it comes to participating in an investigation, there's overriding concern, really, around what is the process, how long will it take, and what will be the effect on your career. And that kind of uncertainty can lead to a reluctance to engage with the investigation. And that reluctance is there even before you consider, the complexity of abuse, its impact, and the very, very real potential to be re-traumatized through investigations looking at abuse. So affected persons need to be told early on about the scope of any investigation, any potential limitations as to what the investigation can sort of reasonably look to achieve, as well as realistic timeframes around how long the investigation will take, and being updated as to any issues and why it should be taking or might be taking longer. And that sort of transparency basically is vital from affected person's perspective. And looking more closely at when abuse is the subject of an investigation, athletes, of course, are straight away more vulnerable, they're more exposed, they're more reluctant to engage. And the imbalances of power are really, really evident. Essentially, athletes suffer harm within their sport. So when that sport looks to investigate, athletes don't know who to trust, which people to trust, which institutions to trust. And that's especially the case when it's not always clear how far removed the alleged abuser is from the people who will then be leading or supporting the investigation. Affected persons run the risk of being judged, blamed, stigmatized, and then really given the burden and responsibility of carrying investigations forward. And that's in the scenario where they have limited resource compared to what's usually at the disposal of the alleged abuser on the other side. So investigators need to address the lack of trust by listening to affected persons and accommodating their concerns throughout the process. I need to meet athletes where they're at, need to find ways to remove that uncertainty from the process and shift power back to affected persons, allowing them to really own the process on their own terms.
Thank you, Miles. So some really helpful, practical tips, which perhaps we can carry on. And Kirsty, you have been leading some really innovative work at the IOC, I think, leading the way from a safeguarding perspective, really trying to implement some of those recognitions that Miles has flagged. What do you think are some of the challenges and some of the problems that investigations need to tackle and the systems that build and structure investigations in sport need to tackle now?
Thanks, Kat, and thank you for having me here today. I think fundamentally, and you mentioned it in your intro, one of the critical challenges that we see is that sports organizations and sport in general has largely pivoted, or when we look at the processes for other integrity issues in sports, such as anti-doping, competition manipulation, there's intelligence gathering, there's investigation, there's adjudication, there's all of these areas. And so we've seen, or we largely see quite often, a sense of pivoting and utilizing by default the same systems for safeguarding cases. It took us a long time, and we're still doing it, to socialize what the word safeguarding means. It's been very difficult. Even we're doing a consensus process now. We've got some of the top scholars in the world looking at 16,000 articles to really come to consensus on key definitions. And safeguarding in sport is something, it's taken a while to socialize what that means. Trauma-informed is another. People don't understand what trauma-informed means. There's a lack of understanding about why we can't just use the same default investigative adjudicatory systems than we can in safeguarding. And so I think it's really, really important, first of all, to realize that is, what I like to say is trauma-informed is not a nice to have. It is essential, and it can hugely impact, of course, first and foremost, the experience of the person who has been harmed, but also it can significantly impact the outcome of the proceedings. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done to try and socialize and make organizations and people understand what does trauma-informed mean and why is it important. And I think, again, we're seeing a lot of sort of grouping of topics or single entry points or coming up with turnkey solutions to abuse within the context of sport. And I have to say that this is a challenge because this is something, safeguarding abuse is so nuanced, it's so contextualized, it's so endemic, not just in sport but in society. Single entry points or oversimplifying the ways to address safeguarding in sport, I think is a critical challenge because it is not simple. I think what we need to understand and what we need to do more of at the moment is recognize, and this was mentioned at the Safe Sport International Conference really well, when we have safeguarding concerns within sport organizations, there are distinct but complementary processes. One is the process around investigation of sport sanctions. So has there been a breach of investigation? And of course, there is so much more that needs to be done to make sure that those investigations are trauma-informed, that we recognize the differences that need to happen when we go through investigative procedures and disciplinary procedures when we have persons who have been harmed in the context of sport and vulnerable persons. So first of all, there's that. But then there's also the safeguarding process, and that is distinct, but also they work closely together, but they are separate in the sense that safeguarding should really be, and I think this is what's fundamentally lacking, and I used to be a physiotherapist a long time ago, and this is the way I like to, this is an analogy that I like to use to try and explain this point. When I was a physio, for athletes used to come to me, or anybody when I was a physio before then for non-athletes, used to come to me and they would explain to me, I would say, how much pain do you have on a scale of 1 to 10? Tell me what your pain is on a scale of 1 to 10. And they would tell me their pain scale. Now, for me, that pain scale didn't give me the diagnosis. Pain is subjective, right? It didn't give me the diagnosis. It told me my diagnosis was on doing further work with them, together with them. But what was important for me was to understand their pain scale, because that gave me a huge indication of the harm that they are feeling, the pain that they are feeling, and that in itself is critical. So we're assessing many things when safeguarding cases occur. We may be assessing, working together with statutory agencies, has something criminal occurred? They may be assessing whether the criminal code has been broken. Sports organizations may be trying to assess whether there's been a sports regulation that's been broken, but the missing fundamental piece is the harm that's been suffered in the middle, and that actually doesn't correspond necessarily to any kind of regulation that we have set or still have to set. It corresponds to the harm the person is feeling, and that is essential, and that is what safeguarding is about, really recognizing the harm that's been done to that person from their perspective and helping them through that. And I think this is what we're fundamentally lacking within the systems at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kirsty Burrows. I've been reminded to make sure that I tell you everybody's name. So Kirsty Burrows, who was preceded by Miles Benjamin. I'm going to go to Joana Moranho in a moment, but just to pull that together, I think there's a theme already emerging here. Miles talked about meeting the athletes where they are. You've talked about really a people-first approach and recognizing that harm. Joana, you're an Olympian. You have changed laws in your country, and you have supported your National Olympic Committee and many others, including me, in trying to change the processes and best practice. Where do you see some of the major challenges in current investigatory processes?
I would first echo everything that my friends have said, and I just want to go a bit into the inherent lack of trust, because that's key. One example is that I recently went to a panel in Germany, which is where I live, and they're trying to build their safe spot entity. And there was one survivor, and she said something that was very strong. She said, just to see the Olympic rings, it triggers me. She was an athlete back in the DDR, and she was forced to dope, sexually harassed, and sexually abused. So even though she was doing the sacrifice to be helping the country to build the safe sport entity, it's not without any costs. So for those of you who work at sports governing bodies, don't take it personal. You represent the institutions and the power that fail to protect us. So don't take it personal. And we talk a lot about independence and how those investigation process, they need to be independent. And that's very important. Some of them are from the government. The government fund those safe sport entities, and some are sport specific and so on. But there is a limitation within independence. Someone is funding those institutions. Someone is paying for your job to do an investigation. Well, most of the countries, as they should, because no one should work for free, especially people with lived experience. So make sure that you are transparent so you can get consent to make sure who is funding you? How are you trying to avoid conflict of interest into the work that you do and into the investigation that you do? And like you said, Kat, the current structures on harassment and abuse, they're often not people-centered, so they are built from a compliance lens, and from a compliance lens is like a thick box, like having a reporting system, having an ethical commission that's going to investigate the violations. And because anti-doping and the whole integrity of sports movement have started from anti-doping, we tend to replicate that. And although anti-doping violations, they are related to safeguarding, in my humble opinion, safeguarding is the biggest threat. Harassment and abuse is the biggest threat to the integrity of sports, and anti-doping and match fixing are just below it. That's not the way to go, because anti-doping investigations, they are about sanctioning the athlete and whether he or she had intentionally or not taken the prohibited substance. We're talking about something else. We're talking about something that's way more complex. And we need to admit, I think that the biggest challenge is for all of us. Like, if you don't have something in place, start now. If you have something in place, just admit and be transparent that is not fit for purpose. There's one relationship between intention and impact. You might have the best intention to set up those investigation system, but they are impacting and harming people who are going through it. So admit it, be transparent. I'm not saying this just on my own experience, both inside and outside sports. If you go from an evidence-based perspective, like literature on the perception of people who went through the investigation process in sport, or if you talk to someone who was harmed, it's unlikely that you're gonna have a positive response. And it's never gonna be comfortable, because you're gonna have to repeat what you've been through, but I'm talking about the human relationship, the interpersonal relationship, and an ethic of care, and this continued effort to mitigate harm.
Thank you, Joanna. And if you, I again remind you, you can look at the participants pack to find out more about these speakers and their incredible expertise. Joanna, I want to stay with you and build on that, if that's okay, and ask you to identify perhaps, I think you made a really good point, is that we need to be really transparent. That's a critical part. I think it's particularly important in abuse cases, because that is the key piece that allows victims and survivors to engage by way of informed consent. And in the context of abuse, it is one of the most important issues. And it requires a bit of courage and a bit of humility, I think, as well. But we also know it is tricky, and people have a lot of competing pressures. So where can people start? What's an obvious or immediate fix that you have seen is common and one of those things that just niggles at you because it's something that should be done quite quickly?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and I mean, we could stay for 5 hours talking about it, right? But okay, let me try to be concise. Usually sports like reactive to scandal, so they're not proactive, and that's like builds on what I have said. When your first response as a sport governing body to a scandal is policy development, and I'm not questioning the importance of policies, they do matter, but that doesn't mean anything to the people who are harmed, because you're building a policy to looking into the future, and that also goes to, oh, I'm gonna start educating people, I'm gonna establish a prevention course. That's awesome, but you're looking into the future, you're pretty much sacrificing those who are being harmed and were harmed in the past. So the obvious immediate fix for me is that we shift the focus, and Semenya has talked about it yesterday, like it doesn't make sense to defend the reputation of an institution that regulates the sports that won't exist without the people who are playing the sports. And we need to put on an intersectionality focus into this, you know, like into race, into gender, disabled people. And so we need to start from those who are the most vulnerable and at the bottom of the pyramid, because like we heard yesterday, they know the truth. And they didn't say they know it all, but they know the truth. So start from them. We don't have, at the moment, an international framework on how investigation should be done, so all of us are trying to like build small pieces of the solutions, which I think like they all matters, but there's one thing in common, that is like without the safe and effective engagement of people with lived experience, you will not build the legitimacy that you need to move forward. When you go through harm, like when I went through harm when I was 9 years old, control was taken from me, not just during the incidents, like I was severely sexually abused by my coach, but control is taken from me all the time. Like I was taking deep breaths before coming here, because to my brain, and this is like scientifically proven, that to my brain, they don't know how to distinguish danger. And that's how hard, and we carry that throughout our life. So if you're going through an investigation process, it's your obligation, the bare minimum, is to give control back to the complainant. And I'll just read some basic elements as I was thinking through, so just basic stuff, like what are your expectations with this investigation? Like, what are people expecting? So you try to balance and don't overpromise and underdeliver. And Miles have touched upon it, like, do you need any clarification with the potential outcomes of this process? Like, make it clear, be transparent all the time. Update them. Some people, they open up to you with something that's so brutal to them, and they hear back from you in 6 months. And I know that investigations, they take long. Like, I volunteer for the Brazilian Ethical Council, and I know they take very long. But just talk to the safeguarding officer, the compliance officer, or whoever is the first focal point to check up on them. Like, how are you doing? What is it that I can do for you? When it comes to the audiences itself, make sure that they know in advance, like, who is participating on the audience, the order of the hearings, whatever you can do to make this process more comfortable. And some of that Miles have covered, and then on the report that you've done as well. But always put the interest of the complainant first. I know there's burden of proof, and the alleged perpetrator needs to be defended, but you need to take the victim side here.
Thank you, Joanna. And thank you for always being so generous and willing to step into these spaces when they cost you so much. And I'm sure everybody shares my gratitude for that. And Joanna has been a key player in our Roadmap to Remedy project. So if all of that has piqued your interest, then you can learn more from her through that. And I think there are some really helpful practical tips there. I would add one to that on the timing point, because I think it's one that it's been a sticking point in many investigations where I've supported victims and survivors. And I think people get nervous about those points of interaction. When do they update? How frequently do they contact people? And I think as a rule of thumb, ask early on. Ask someone, ask them whether they want to be kept updated at regular intervals, how they want to be communicated with, how they tell you that actually they want to change that pattern and that process. Work as a team and give them control. As Joanna said, I think it's critically important. Kirsty, same question to you. I know it's a complex one because you have a detailed, long-term, sustainable approach at the IOC, and I'm mindful of Michelle Moore as well refusing to answer the question yesterday, quite rightly, because these problems are complex and require multiple different elements to fix them. But what's at the forefront of your mind that you see, perhaps one of the tips that you give National Olympic Committees if they ask you for help? Where do you think there are opportunities, low-hanging fruit for sports bodies?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, as you say, my role with what we're doing with the IOC is to try and see how we can build. And again, I'm really conscious that harm has been done, and today, yesterday, 10 years ago is not fast enough, right? There is a need to, and I understand this need and the depth of this need for things to change. But it's difficult because in my role, what I'm also really conscious of is the fact that we need to take steps to ensure that when we're trying to build longer-term solutions, that we also take a safeguarding approach that doesn't risk to do more harm. And that also means making sure that the ways that we look to seek to address this. So, for example, you may know the IOC just announced a 10 million fund per Olympiad to strengthen safeguarding at the national level. And that fundamentally will be sport working together with state and civil society, recognizing that we cannot do this alone. But then people say to me, okay, but Kirsty, this is going to take a couple of years to set up these hubs, these victim support hubs that we're going to be setting up. I say, yes, and I recognize that change can't come fast enough, and we're already too late. There's already a lot of people that have been harmed. But it's also really important to ensure that the steps that we take do not risk in any way doing more harm by, for example, overpromising and underdelivering. So we have to be measured. We have to make sure what we're doing is sustainable. We have to make sure we do full consultation. We involve the voices of athletes with lived experience throughout the process of establishing mechanisms to really try and change the status quo. So the faster, low-hanging fruit kind of term options are more challenging for me because my mandate is really looking at, okay, longer term, how can we seek to address this? But I recognize the urgency, and I recognize that things can't happen fast enough, and I recognize that that is valid and completely understandable. And so I think one of the things that I would say is really, and again, but this is with being very careful, I think it's important to review the systems that we have in place currently, working together with athletes and especially with those with lived experience of abuse, to do a critical analysis of the systems that are in place within your organization. But I also say that knowing full well that if you're going to do that, you have to make sure that you are able to meaningfully engage with people with lived experience of abuse, because also further harm can be done if you don't have the skills and competency and knowledge and awareness of how to meaningfully engage. So, as I say, it's one of the things that I think is critical and the most important is really to upskill your people, is to identify those who can become safeguarding champions, is to ensure that you make sure that there are training courses available. We have a safeguarding officer certificate. We're working together now to develop an international safe sport framework, guidelines for trauma-informed investigation. That's all coming. But again, it's not a fast fix. It'll be a year or two until we have that in place. But I think what we can do right now is to say to organizations, first of all, understand what does trauma-informed mean, understand the specificities of safeguarding vis-a-vis any other integrity issue or any other breach that you have within the context of sport, and speak to those who have experienced harm. But if you do so, make sure that you first of all find someone who can help you to do that. So I think I wish I had more shorter term, simpler actions, but I think that, again, oversimplifying this, rushing too fast, taking steps without looking at the unintended consequences also can be dangerous and harmful. So it's a step, but the most important thing I would say is, and this is, sorry, I should say this because I think this is critical. I think it's important to recognize that sports organizations have an essential role to play, of course, an essential role to play that they must play related to safeguarding. Prevention and the first response are critical, and sports organizations should embed those within their systems. I also think it's important to recognize that sports organizations shouldn't go beyond their competency and capacity when it comes to safeguarding, aka when somebody has been harmed, unfortunately in the context of sport, there is a level to which they have the specialist expertise and ability to be able to go further and provide that support. Now, they have a critical role to play and they need to have trained individuals to provide that support. But what is essential is to recognize that in any field, moving beyond your competency is also risky for that person that is vulnerable, the person who has been harmed. So it's mapping and finding the people that do have that skill set. Who does have that skill set? Who is this organization that can provide further support? Recognizing that me as a sports organization, it's not my, I'm not saying me, but if I was to be a sports organization, my MO is not specifically to understand exactly what is trauma, what is secondary trauma, what is victimization, what is psychosocial support, what is understanding so many other fields that are important when it comes to case management and supporting those with lived experience. So I think it's also to recognize, and maybe that's my first point that I would say to sports organizations, know what you must do, also know what is beyond your competency and capacity to do, and that doesn't mean that you don't have to do it, it means that you have to find the people who can. And I would say that would be my first point of call. Before you have a case that comes to you, because we all know that they're there, just from the literature that we see in terms of the prevalence of abuse. So before you have a case that comes to you, if you haven't already, map already your systems, map who is competent and able to provide support, and try your best not to be reactive, because the people that are harmed the most when you're reactive are those who have placed their trust in you when trust has been broken before, but have placed their trust in you with coming forward.
Thank you, Kirsty. And I think we got there with some really practical, helpful suggestions. So map your own competencies, understand where your limits are, find those people who can complement and support. And I think also, I strongly agree, review the policies and the processes in your systems and do that with the support of affected persons if you are able to engage them safely. And I'm pleased to say that one of the key documents that Joanna and I have co-authored together with others will be out very shortly and is specifically around safe, appropriate and effective engagement of affected persons. So how can all of the players in this ecosystem bring in, hear, and incorporate the perspective and voices of victims, survivors, and whistleblowers while mitigating and managing the harm and sharing the cost and the burden to them. So do please keep an eye out for that. Miles, to you then perhaps with this question as well around what are some of the evident, immediate or obvious fixes that you think, some practical tips that people may be able to take away?
Yeah, well, as Joanna touched on, policies are only part of the solution, but I do actually think it's an area where you can potentially make an immediate improvement, and that's around accessibility. Where it's needed, sports bodies should be helping affected persons by publishing shortened, simpler versions of their policies and procedures, and making sure that these shortened versions are clearly signposted, well advertised, and simply easy to access. This could mean that they're easier to understand and therefore apply by the very people for whose use they're intended or should be intended, which are the affected persons. And this can be part of a broader drive, really, to drive to increase the capacity of affected persons to actually engage with investigations. Kirsty talked about the importance of upskilling within organizations and building capacity within organizations to deal with abuse. But I do think there is some scope for organizations to help athletes, to educate athletes, continually educate athletes as to what their rights are and what mechanisms are currently available to respond to violations of those rights. And I think generally reminding athletes and reinforcing to athletes what their rights are is important as well, because research kind of points to it's quite difficult for athletes sometimes to recognize certain treatment as abuse. And abuse can be subtle. It can be by way of neglect, for example. It can be manipulative. And where athletes are already internalizing norms around sport of, being tough, being resilient, working yourself and pushing your limits to achieve high performance, it can be difficult in that scenario to actually recognize abusive behavior for what it is. And having said all that, though, I think at the risk of overgeneralizing, I think really to increase engagement, athletes need to see and feel a culture within their sport that genuinely welcomes and values that engagement, and genuinely need to find a desire to actually learn from the experiences and perspectives of affected persons. It's not easy or quick to build the kind of belief within affected persons that they can receive remedy from the systems that exist at all. But there are a few practical steps that I think can help within the investigation process. For example, affected persons should be acknowledged and thanked for the, I've lost my train of thought, for the courage, essentially, that they've shown in participating in an investigation. Sports bodies should plainly recognize and acknowledge that harm has been suffered, and they should check in regularly with athletes as to their well-being and monitor any perceived threats to their well-being throughout the process. And some of these suggestions are, common sense or empathetic suggestions, and they're difficult, therefore, to kind of formally codify in policy. But I think they will happen when the culture is genuinely one in which athlete safety is a top priority. And I think when athletes feel and see that culture, greater engagement will follow.
Miles, you've segued beautifully into some of the questions that have come forward. So I think the first thing I would say is some of these are around more generally framed for victim survivors and whistleblowers, some particularly around athletes. I think it's right to say that athletes are at a particular risk, but I also want to acknowledge that there are victims, survivors and whistleblowers in our sporting community more broadly, referees, parts of the multidisciplinary team, clinical team, coaches, etc. So we'll broaden some of this out. I'm going to group two of these together. I think, Joanna, I might bounce the first one to you, so just a heads up on that, but others may want to jump in. So the first question is, how can victims, survivors and whistleblowers best be supported when going through this process? And what can sports bodies do? And I'm going to group that with this one, which is how can athletes be made more aware of systems that are there and who is responsible for doing so? I think that really builds on Miles's last point. So maybe I'll go Joanna, Kirsty, and then Miles, if that works for you guys.
Yeah, sure. I think we've been touching upon that for a while, and I think one of the key things is like the safe and effective engagement of all of us with lived experience. And when I say all of us, because what happens is that sometimes sports governing bodies tend to engage like one person with lived experience. And I must say, like, I don't know it all. I'm an expert in my own story. I don't know what it's like to go through harm in sport as a trans person or as an LGBTQ person. So that's very important to say. And when I say us, like colleagues by experience, we have different ways of seeing the solution and the way forward. Like I'm reading the book of Rosa Luxemburg, and she's like worked a lot on labor rights, and she says like workers, they need to be at the forefront, even though they see the way out or the way forward differently. Some of us want to work within the system because they feel like that's within the system and cooperating with the sports governing bodies, and that's how they're going to make change, and we need to respect that. Another group of us, and I feel like that's where I'm standing at the moment, we kind of work from outside the system, but collaborating in our own terms. I like collaborating with sports governing bodies in my own terms, but there is a group of us who is very vocal about operating from outside the system, and that's also legitimate. And these are the important voices that sport governing bodies need to hear, because that's how we're going to build the solution. So I'm not sure if I'm really responding to the question, but just a part of it to make sure, one, that we listen to multiple voices, and that's to people, and that goes to people who went through the same experience. It's not because someone is adopting a different strategy. Like if we go up against each other, kind of like giving the power and the status quo, they are winning. So we need to get together and be mindful that we need to cooperate in our own terms. So I think I'm going to stop there and then go to Kirsty.
Thank you. And I was just thinking about this question about athletes being more informed of where they can report to. That was the second part of the question, was that right?
More aware of the systems that are there, I think more broadly, and who is responsible for ensuring that athletes know their rights. Not just, I think, reporting, support, care.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we also know from like literature, it's a lot easier to be, and also because of, and as has been discussed, trust is a critical factor, right? So being able to also not have a single point where you can report to and having multiple different options and avenues, we know that that's really, really important. At the same time, I think that it's really challenging in sport. The jurisdictional landscape is extremely challenging, I think, to navigate. And it's really hard as well when I can imagine if I were to, and I don't want to put my voice to those of the victims and survivors who have come forward, but I can imagine that if I were, from the perspective of somebody that has finally spoken up, saying, okay, but this isn't ours, you're under the jurisdiction or this, or it has to go through this way, can be extremely, having to then retell that story or being sent somewhere else. Also, from the sport organization perspective, I understand why they're saying that, because they have a strict jurisdiction where they are able to act over a certain group. So see, it's extremely challenging, and so I think, and I think the harm that can be caused there is again, having to repeat your story or being told you have to go somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it is critically important to ensure that we can try and inform people within the context of sport, of what their options are, where they're available to. But I also think, again, this is why we're, in establishing this hub model, we're trying to ensure that there will be a centralized point of expertise where anyone can call and they'll have all their options laid out for them and tell them where they can go, et cetera, in a trusted and impartial environment. So something that is separate from the sports organization and whose role it is to sort of facilitate access to recourse and remedy. So I do think it's critical to actually ensure that we can better to help people in sport, make them aware of the pathways. I personally think one of the very best ways we can do that, though, actually is, as I say, multiple reporting systems at different levels are important. But from my experience, I think having a focal point, having somebody who may not be a fully trained safeguarding officer, because we recognize that's not always important, especially for smaller clubs at the local level, but having a safeguarding focal point, a safeguarding champion, having somebody with a face that's in your own culture, in your own language, that you know, that you trust, that you can go to, who is then able to inform you of the different options that's available to you. I think that's critically important. I think we need to localize solutions. And I think we also have to recognize that in abuse, whether it occurs in sport or anywhere else, speaking up is one of the most difficult things. We see this. We know the dark number of in society about cases that are convicted versus the sheer prevalence rates of abuse in sport. We know it takes decades many times for people to speak up about the abuse that they've suffered. So I think it's really important also to not place the burden on the athlete. I think it's really important, of course, that we educate, we provide the information and we make sure that it's clear where you can go. But I think ensuring that the entourage and people around them, ensuring that there's a heightened recognition of the fact that the onus shouldn't always be on the athlete to be the one that says something is definitely going wrong and I need to speak up about this. But there are people that have training, that are around, that understand their context, who they trust, that they can speak to, I think is essential.
Kat, may I just follow up very quickly? Because I was thinking about what Kirsty have said, and just one practical example. And like I said, just basic elements of what is working. By far, the Brazilian Ethical Commission, it's not fit for purpose. And I volunteer there, and I acknowledge the many problems we have. But one thing is that those reporting system and how you can approach it, it needs to be tailored to your own culture. Like recently, like back end, they could do it through the compliance officers, through the website, and through the athletes commission. And recently, because athletes have required, you can also do it through WhatsApp. So there are 4 ways in Brazil that is tailored to our culture for you to report. So that's also important because it can be culture specific and sport specific. Sorry, I just had to.
Yeah, not much to add, but I think broadly it is the responsibility of the sports body to help athletes, and protect athletes, and really provide that network for athletes to report any concerns. And they should be using sort of trusted networks that athletes have, so leaning on unions, leaning on civil society, leaning on supporter groups. And those are the kind of networks that often have more trust amongst affected persons. And so if that's a way of disseminating information to those affected persons, they should be using those vehicles as well. And I think there's definitely an element of upskilling sports bodies as well, making sure that enough people in the organisation are trauma-informed and able to actually receive the information or the report of concern from the affected person, because it's not always going to be the case that the affected person, reports through the right channel. They may not know. So if they're reporting to a peer, if they're reporting to an assistant coach, that kind of relationship, there needs to be a basic understanding of what to do with that report and who that needs to be escalated to. And I think that's really the sports body's responsibility.
Thank you, Miles. Now, we only have 5 minutes left for questions, and lots more good questions have come in. I'm going to shift it a little bit to some of the systems and structures, and I'm going to give you 2 questions, and you can choose which one you want to answer. The first one is, how do you see the role of external safe sport entities funded by governments? Is there cooperation? I'm going to repeat that because I had to read it twice. So I think this is about safe sport entities not run by sports federations, but national, for example, national safe sport entities. And is there scope or need for cooperation? That's question one. You can choose that one. Question two goes a little bit beyond investigations, but a really important one. What is the role of the Court of Arbitration for Sport? What can CAS do to ensure the processes are trauma-informed? And I think it's important because we need to make sure that the whole system carries a thread through it where there is collaboration. And Kirsty's touched on how the sports legal system is so disjointed and so complex that's one of the big challenges we face. So you can pick one, but only one, and I'm going to give you 90 seconds to answer these very difficult questions, maybe 2 minutes. So either the Safe Sport Entity one or the CAS one.
I'll pick the Safe Sport Entity one. So again, I think that there's a real challenge in, I recognize that there are people working in Safe Sport entities who are trying to do a phenomenal job. I think that when we recognize just the prevalence rates of abuse, it's extremely, we need to be mindful that, first of all, entities that are too independent from sport, there is a critical gap. Whilst independence is important, we've recognized that independence is important. I think there are other terms like accountable, not completely isolated from sport, because otherwise there's a lack of learning that comes through. And I think that learning is really, really critically important. I also think that it's important to recognize, again, for me, it's this kind of single entry point idea. I think that when you recognize just the scale of abuse and recognizing as well that we have different forms of abuse and abuse is on a continuum, and here you have poor practice, which are critical and essential things to be able to address. Now, I think one of the challenges is when you have a single entry point, you either end up kind of subdividing trauma, so saying, okay, well, this isn't enough for us to take it on or not, or you end up being completely overloaded with so many cases and not being able to meet the expectations of those that are reporting into you. So I think that there is, safe sport entities can play an important role, but I think they have to be part of a safeguarding ecosystem. I don't think that they are a turnkey solution to addressing sport within any context. And I think that there is, again, it's about not oversimplifying. So I think, yes, when there are safe sport entities, they can have an essential role, but I think we have to be mindful that they are part of much, and they cannot exist on their own and be expected to be able to fundamentally change the dynamic within sport for safer environments where everyone can thrive and meet the needs of those who are reporting in.
Just very quickly, I think the question here is like who regulates the regulator and who holds the regulator accountable, and that's a big philosophical discussion between the autonomy of sport and so on. But they are safe sport entities, they're funded by the government, so outside the sport's current jurisdiction. So I'm a big believer that we need two frameworks, convention, whatever you want to call it. We need one from the sports governing bodies, from the IOC, but we also need one that's going to be done by UN, UNESCO, or something, so we can hold those states' mandates accountable, because it's not because they fund it that they are free to do whatever they want. So we need those two frameworks, and we need to review those frameworks continuously with the engagement of affected people.
Jump in quickly, and yeah, I think just to add on to Kirsty's point, yeah, safe sport entities need to cooperate with the existing structures as well, and you need that that crossover of learning, and you need a consistency of approach as well, which again touches on your point around if you do end up with a sort of subdivision of cases, and depending on the severity, they go to this entity and or that entity, there is a risk of a lack of consistency of process, which is always what athletes or affected persons are, seeking is transparency and consistency and being able to anticipate what the process will be and how they'll be treated and how they'll be protected. So yeah, that cooperation is definitely required.
Thank you. Right. Well, we are coming to the end of this session, so I'm going to ask you all to conclude, I guess, with a bit of a rallying call to action. I hope that all of you have been as inspired as I've been in these last 2 days, and recognize that there is much more to be done, but also much that can be achieved. So either short term or longer term, what's your rallying call? I'll start with you again, Kirsty, and work your way back to me.
Thank you. So it's going back to what I mentioned very briefly. Recently, the IOC did a 10 million fund per Olympiad to strengthen safeguarding at the local level. We are coming up with a hub model. There'll be a development of an international task force. What it is this whole system has been based on the fact that there is need for collaboration, as I mentioned, between sport, state, and civil society at all levels. And also that there's need to make sure that we collaborate effectively and meaningfully with athletes with lived experience throughout the establishment of these processes. So my call to you is to recognize that we cannot do this alone. And I really hope that if you would like to speak further about this hub model that we're developing, because again, it is essential that we do a full consultation and that we really work together, sport, state, and civil society, recognizing our distinct but complementary roles and responsibilities, and that we want the same thing from this hub model. What we want to see is environments where those in sport, in the whole sport ecosystem, so not just athletes, but also others in the ecosystem, as Kat mentioned, can thrive. So I would say, please cooperate, as in collaborate together, make sure that we tear down some of these kind of sections, as in we're sport, we're government, we're civil society, work together. This has to be collective action, and this is what our hub model is all about. So my call to action is to collaborate to really foster that dialogue. And I hope that if anyone has any queries or questions or is interested to learn more about this, the regional hub model that we're looking to establish, then I'm very happy to talk anytime. Thank you very much.
So due to time constraints, I'm just going to say a short. It's going to stop harming us, take action, and allocate more resources. That's it.
And for me, just be proactive about learning about abuse, its impact, and the cultures that foster abuse. And in doing so, kind of have the humility to recognize that abuse is not confined to one particular sport or a region. It's a societal issue, and it most likely will be taking place within one's own sport. And yeah, I think there has been a tendency perhaps in the past when cases arise in one particular sport for everyone to say, well, oh, that's the sport with the problem, when realistically just because cases aren't being reported widely or they're not erupting into a big scandal, it doesn't mean it's not happening. So it's just recognizing that abuse will be happening and trying to get ahead and be proactive and tackle it head on.
Thank you, Miles. So I opened this session by acknowledging that this is perhaps one of the toughest issues that we are to tackle and that sport has had to grapple with. I trust that having heard from Joanna, that you can see that there is expertise and willingness here for those with lived experience, as long as their safe and meaningful participation can be facilitated. So I would invite you to invite them in to help build solutions, to stress test them and work together. And I also trust that you've seen that there are sports bodies that can and must be game changers, and that the right people with the right attitude, if they're open-minded, if they're not defensive, and if they walk the talk, can be real agents for change. I think for others here, for governments, for broadcasters and sponsors, there is an important role to play. We heard that yesterday. I think when you are engaging with sport, make sure that there are resources available, not just to facilitate programming and safeguarding, but also to ensure that there are remedy mechanisms in place, that there are accountability structures. If you are a sponsor, ask questions, not just about the commitments, but how those commitments will be enforced, will be measured, and if those things go wrong, what remedy will be available. I really do believe that if we work together, there is huge scope for improvement here. And so finally, I'll say that the Centre for Sport and Human Rights is also here to help. It is our job. And Daniela and I will be running the second round of our masterclass in conjunction with the Asser Institute next year. You can see there is a 15% discount on the Investigations Masterclass. If you use that code and if you scan that QR code, then you will go straight to the website and you will be asked to insert a discount code. So please do that. Please join us. Kirsty was there last year. Miles was there. Joanna contributed. It was an amazing experience for all of us, so I hope to see you there. And then finally, I'll ask you to join me not just in thanking this extraordinary panel, but the victims, survivors, and whistleblowers of abuse, discrimination, and injustice for leading with hope and with courage on this road to remedy. Thank you so much.
A nice tribute there and a nice moment for us to reflect on the people that continue to make such a difference by coming forward and telling their stories over and over. But Kat, thank you to you also for the amazing work you do. A round of applause for Kat, please. So now to the closing plenary, bringing sport and human rights to life at the host city level. And this is all important because it's a new area, isn't it? It's a new domain for every single sporting body, every single host city, host nation that now sees human rights written into the contracts that are handed out. So I'd like to welcome the speakers for this closing plenary. Bringing sport and human rights to life at the host city level, Mary Harvey will be back. Also, Minal Davis from Houston 26, the Human Rights Chair, Dan Diamond, Director of Programs at Athlete Ally, Matt Mullen, the Head of Human Rights for FIFA World Cup 2026, and Lee Streeb, International Affairs Team at AFL-CIO. Please make them welcome.
Home stretch. It's on? Okay, it's on. All right, great. So home stretch. This is going to be a fast pace. I also want to acknowledge our fabulous interpreters who have been the voices inside our ears to help us understand in your language of choice. Thank you very much. A round of applause for the interpreters. I will also say that and it's important to acknowledge labor rights. We are running over, but that doesn't mean that they will. So at noon, it's possible that if you're listening in French or Spanish, you may be switching to English. I apologize for that, but we have to acknowledge that they have been working for 3 hours, and that is the limit. But we're going to go quickly through this panel. We're going to keep it at a quick pace. I've been dying to have this panel. So first of all, again, this is just going to be a quick trip through mega sporting events. So now we've been through a lot around athletes and all sorts of challenges around sport governance, day-to-day sport. Now we're going to go back to sporting events and mega sporting events. And this is a new age, as Tracy mentioned. As of 2023, the IOC events, the FIFA events, the UEFA events now all have human rights responsibilities into the bidding and awarding and now the implementation of these responsibilities in the events. So we thought we'd bring this to life for you because this is history happening and it's happening right now. So that said, as with previous World Cups, it's about implementation. Right? So we've come a long way. For those of you in the room who have worked for years to see these bidding requirements put in place, to then have strategies that would then respond to those bidding requirements that had human rights in them, and now it's time for implementation. So we're going to talk about that. Matt Mullen, Dr. Mullen, just going to have some fun because you are a PhD. Tell me what your role is, because you had a role that didn't exist prior to 2023. I mean, in terms of, major events. What is your role with 2026, the organizing committee?
All right, great. So thank you so much, Mary, and thanks to everybody for the opportunity. So I'm the head of human rights for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, and as such, there's kind of two main dimensions to our work. So the first one is FIFA's human rights programs and human rights due diligence. So where you're looking at accessibility, anti-discrimination, safeguarding programs our responsible sourcing efforts, labor rights efforts, and then also our reporting portal, and then another layer of heightened human rights due diligence wherever it's necessary. So that's sort of the FIFA impact focus. The other thing that we're doing is working very closely with host cities to make sure that they're ready, tournament ready from a human rights perspective. And that piece of it has been a real area of emphasis to date because we recognize that takes a lot of time, right? So we're working very closely, and that's kind of the impetus for today is to talk about the implementation framework that we're rolling out.
Okay, terrific. We'll get back to the framework in a minute. Inal, you have been involved with the 2026 process from when it was a bid. Talk a little bit about, just briefly, your role with the bid in terms of human rights. Well, first of all, what you do with the mayor's office, so prevention of human trafficking, which is not every, in fact, very few offices have that function. But then your role with the bid when Houston was a bid city, and then your role since then as you've been selected for a bid city and now as you look to implement.
Okay, sure. I'm happy to be here. So I serve as the founding director of the Houston Mayor's Office of Human Trafficking, and I was appointed in 2015, and at that time, it was the first position like this in the United States. So it was the first time anyone was looking at the plethora of municipal assets and leveraging them to address trafficking. So when the human rights due diligence came down to bidding cities, we were in one sense very ready, right? Because we had done this trafficking work at that point for 5 or 6 years when the host committee president approached me. And then in a second sense, we were not ready at all because human rights work doesn't happen through municipal governments, right? And that's the struggle and the gap and the chasm that we need to bridge before 2026. So what we did is take the human rights due diligence and just read it again and again. Yesterday, I know they were asking, like, what are the skill sets? It's like reading comprehension and a bias for action, right, if you want to do this work. So we read it until we understood it. We had a subcommittee already established prior to this, so we had some sub-governance structure in place, and all of us were reading it, and then we worked to translate it. And that meant engaging about 120 stakeholders in 4 months and very short notice across 8 human rights areas, and developing a way that we can do that efficiently. And the stakeholder input, they were really at the core of what we were doing. That input was reflected in our final product, which was our human rights plan, which is critical to doing this work.
Okay, so we're going to get to Leah and Dan in a minute, but so one of the things that was my experience, right? So when I'm writing the human rights strategy back in the bid phase, I read the human rights requirements for the FIFA that many of you actually had your fingerprints on, and I didn't understand them. And I read them, and because I didn't have a human rights background, right? I didn't understand what it truly meant when you say due diligence. Well, it's actually a technical term. There are moving pieces to that. And so my experience was exactly the same. It was through engaging with stakeholders, including those with much better basic knowledge and technical knowledge of human rights instruments and human rights processes, that I could understand what I needed in order to do the work. And that's exactly, I think, what you've just described. Now, I want to get back to the framework. So there's a process, right? FIFA makes a commitment to respect human rights. Then the Ruggie report, right, as part of that, the Ruggie report. If you don't know what the Ruggie report is, look it up, Google it. It's a masterpiece of work. It's basically, how does FIFA implement human rights into it as an organization? The first part is put it into your bidding requirements. So that happens. The first bidding process that's opened is for 2026 under that new commitment. The requirements are asked of the bidding countries to respond to that. They do in the form of a risk assessment that's independent and a strategy to span the gap between the current situation in laws and practice in the countries that want to host and international human rights standards, right? So that's the strategy, is how you span that gap. So that's where we were, and now we have 16 cities selected, and now we're going to take that strategy and start to implement it. But there's another step that's missing, Matt, and that's a framework. So talk about what that framework is and why it's needed.
Yeah, so during the bid process, FIFA collected a lot of really useful material. We had the proposed strategy. We had these city-level reports and plans during the host city selection process. We had impact assessments. We had all kinds of material to work with. The key was, how do we bring it all together? And so that was the task when I came on and when we dug into this work. And so the first thing we realized is we have all this material, but we still have to go back to the experts and the key stakeholders and say, okay, how do we interpret all this? How do we bring all of this, all these commitments, all these proposals into something that's workable? So the goal was we got to reach something that's robust, but also realistic, that's encompassing, but also accessible, and that's adaptable so that host cities can kind of prioritize where they need to. And the only way to figure that all out, because it was a complex undertaking, was to consult extensively with those key stakeholders. And so that's what we've done really for a whole year, is work very closely with these stakeholder groups and experts to say, how do we set this up? How do we frame this? And so where we landed is a host city human rights framework. It's going to be published next year. And we are dealing with a three-part framework that we've tried to make as sort of straightforward and accessible as possible. You have inclusion and safeguarding as part one. Part two is workers' rights. And part three is access to remedy. And so what we're going to have is all of these host cities, all 16 host cities, are going to develop tailored human rights action plans for the tournament based on that framework. And to the point about this is the task now is we've kind of got this implementation framework in place, and how do we now get to those local realities? How do we reach those lived experiences?
Okay, so you said in consultation with. Consultation, negotiation?
Both.
Okay. Okay. So, all right. So, and I'm not trying to give you a hard time. It's just, it's tough, right? So, when you're developing the framework, what was the goal? So, you talked about stakeholder engagement. As you can tell, trust building is critical here. So, how do you build trust with a group of stakeholders who've maybe looked at what's happened in the past, right? Now you want something from them, which is, stakeholder engagement, and you have to build trust. How did you go about building that trust when you are engaging? We're going to talk about what Dignity 2026 is. Lee, I think you're going to introduce what that is in a minute. But how do you start to build trust with stakeholders when maybe in the past, prior to all of this, perhaps trust has been not established?
For sure. So I think really it was meet and meet again. So the first couple of meetings, it was really trying to get to know each other, quite literally saying, okay, now we have this new task and here's what we're trying to do, and hearing out from the side of the coalition, what are their questions and concerns? And then being open with them about, here are things I have clarity on. I have a lot of uncertainties as well. And so sort of just clearly setting the parameters for the engagement at the outset and having, frankly, very difficult conversations very early and often, and that sort of created this sense of, okay, we're actually trying to get somewhere. Like, this is going to be a difficult process, we both know that, but we're willing to see it through, and I think it was that kind of commitment to, it's always showing up, right? After the meeting, you're not sure where it's going, schedule the next meeting, keep going. So that was kind of the I think, critical piece.
Meenal, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that sharing your leadership space at the local level is critical. You have these ambiguous international human rights frameworks that exist up here, and then you have to make them, like the panel's named, come to life at the local level. You can't do that without the stakeholders and opening up your leadership space. There was so much talk about governance and the power dynamics, and that's the way that you do that. You really open up the space for them to be heard so that their input is, reflected in those docs again. I'll say it again. And so what we did is, there were a lot of reports and things like that we couldn't share electronically. So we had office hours, for instance, so that they could come and at least view them and see that what we were saying was true. So that's how we work to establish trust. And now we don't even have to do things like that. They trust us when we say it.
Okay, terrific. Now we're going to bring in the stakeholders who were consulted, right? So this is really where the rubber hits the road, right? When we're talking about building trust, it's one thing to have the outreach, but then it's also important to talk to those that they were engaging with. So I'm now going to invite in Lee and Dan, but Lee, we're going to start with you on first of all, who is Dignity 2026? And it's not just you two up, you're representing a coalition. Mickey Warden was also part of that coalition and others. So talk a little bit about who is Dignity 2026 and talk about sort of the reflections on the process of engagement in developing and finalizing the framework.
Yes, so thanks for having me on the panel. Dignity 2026 is a coalition, as you said, primarily of national organizations in the U.S., and it's very broad. It includes labor unions. I come out of the AFL-CIO coming to this work, the Labor Federation in the U.S., but it includes community organizing networks, human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, migrant rights organizations, LGBTQ plus groups, sports equity activists, fans organizations. So it's a really broad network. And we came together ourselves, even before entering this conversation with FIFA, to say, we've got to work with each other closely and engage with FIFA and our local affiliates with the host cities to express our collective concerns about the risks that are involved here and about what are some of the opportunities. And I think we were worried about kind of a divide and conquer risk that comes from some of this that we've seen historically with this. And we knew that we had more power together. I think in terms of reflecting on the engagement, a couple things that worked well. As Matt said, Matt listened and was responsive, and the others on the FIFA team were. As he said, there was skepticism going in, and I think fundamentally Matt and the team listened to us. And they, for example, we made very clear in our public action before this process that having minimum standards set around a range of our issues was really important, and we said that, and that became a key element of the framework, as folks will see. I think the other point is this wasn't just consultation. It was a very intensive, year-long process of discussion about this framework, and whether it's a negotiation or not, as someone who comes from out of a union background, it felt a lot like negotiation, and in a good way, and we have a product that I think we all own from that. I can speak to challenges too, but.
Yeah, well, speak to challenges, then I'd like to bring Dan in.
So on the challenges front, a couple things, and Dan will add to this. I think one challenge, certainly for us, was how do we as activists balance the need to take public action to put pressure on organizations and this process of getting into a serious dialogue and negotiation. So I think we had to struggle with that. Not to speak for FIFA, I could tell that they were struggling with that as well, for sure. That we had, in the spring of 2022, we had a lot of very public and critical activity that we were engaged in, and they could have said, like, who are these people? Do we really, what are the risks to us in getting in this? And to their credit, they did, engage in a serious process there. I think the other challenge I'd mention was on our side, could we, given the history of some of FIFA's, behavior, it was a leap of faith for people in the coalition who, are skeptical and suspicious. And so we had to, we had to kind of jump in not knowing whether through this long process we were going to yield something that was worthwhile or whether we were going to.
It's a trust barrier.
Yeah, it was just going to be a snowdrop. So that's what I would say.
Terrific. Thanks. Thanks, Lee. Dan, just your perspective. So you were involved in this whole process as well. And again, you speak on behalf of many others. Athlete Ally advocates for LGBTQI plus inclusion in sport and does incredible work. Talk to me a little bit about the experience that you had as one of the key stakeholders in this process.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me and Athlete Ally as a part of this panel. Lee gave a really great overview, and I think what I would add is on the trust building piece with Matt. I mean, I was smiling as Matt was talking about the number of consultations we did. I mean, we as a coalition really put Matt through the ringer, and he had so many conversations upon conversations with the larger group, with the smaller group on individual issues, and that really did provide the space to build that trust and that transparency and that consistency of communication. And I think the other piece around the trust building was the transparency. So we knew early on from Matt if something was going to happen, if it wasn't going to happen, if there were challenges that we really needed to grapple with as a coalition to bring new or different language to the table. And so that was also really helpful because there were no surprises. And I think the other piece too is I really can't understate what an uphill battle Matt had after Qatar, building relationships with groups that were incredibly frustrated and disillusioned with FIFA. And so I think that still is an ongoing process, and I just want to name that explicitly, but it's also with stakeholder engagement overall, it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be messy, and to do good work, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in these spaces because that's how real change happens.
I mean, that was my experience as well, right? It isn't, but you need to, if you're trying to understand how to faithfully provide, fulfill your responsibilities, right, as, tournament organizers and cities, the only way you're going to understand the risk is to talk to people who represent those who are affected by the risk. But it's about taking that brave step and being willing to go there and be uncomfortable, right? But I knew I've been following this process for a while, but coming out the other end, let's talk about the framework. But before we get to the frameworks, that's just a cue to say we're going to talk now about the framework and how you feel about where it is right now and what's key to moving forward. Meenal, I want to bring you back in, as a city and sort of seeing this whole negotiation going on, what were key sort of learnings for you or things that maybe were unexpected that either, positive or negative, but just that you went through at the city level?
From what regard? From the framework itself? Or?
Just interacting with stakeholders. So you mentioned interacting with stakeholders at the local level, right? So Matt's working at sort of and we're going to talk about Canada and Mexico because we've been talking a lot about the United States. It's also important to acknowledge there are 3 countries, 5 other venues that are outside of the United States. But you did this at a local level, right? So at the city level, which is really, and we have host cities here today, right? From 2026, from Euro 2024, and from LA 2028. So what advice or sort of what were the key learnings for you?
So one of the challenges that we had was, a lot of the national organizations have local level offices, and sometimes we have to work to streamline the agendas, the requests that come through for incorporation. So that was something we had to work through at the local level. And it was a negotiation, it was a clarity, it was a communication, a collaboration-based type conversation, but that's something that can be pretty inconsistent, right? So I'll bring Lee back into the conversation. It was a funny story. We had a good laugh about it at dinner last night, but local AFL-CIO was requesting one thing, national AFL-CIO at the time was requesting another.
And this is a right-to-work state, which may not, so there's certain rule, well, you can explain what that means, but.
Right-to-work state means we are about 20% unionized across the state. It means workers don't have a lot of rights. Yeah, I'm in Texas, right? Don't judge me because of that, though. But I live there now.
The hair's not big enough.
Thank you. And so essentially, the right-to-work state really brings a lot of complications into the workers' rights, the migrants' issue, all of that becomes a lot more complex because of our lack of laws and because of where we're situated geographically when it comes to the border with Mexico. And so it's incredibly important that for the World Cup and just generally, that is an area of focus. And so that, of course, meant these conversations with the labor unions locally. And then, I had to have these national conversations that were uncomfortable at first, and then we sorted it out. And now it's a great relationship, and we're so glad to have the support of local AFL-CIO. The thing is, we feel like we turned the tide, right? For a moment, they seemed to be adversarial, but then they were writing op-eds in the big newspaper in Houston supporting us for the bid, and that was great.
Okay, that's amazing. And I mean, the whole point is when people say, well, we don't, and I'm just going to say Texas for a minute, well, we don't have to do that. The law doesn't say we have to do that, right? We hear that all the time. But that's not the point. The point is that international laws and practice, or international standards are here, and that's what's the responsibility if you're organizing a tournament like the World Cup now or the Olympic Games. And local laws and practice, there's going to be a gap. It's how you fill the gap, where maybe you don't have to legally, but yet to fulfill your responsibility in staging the tournament, you have to fill the gap. So it's about how you fill that gap, and this is what we're talking about here. And particularly in the state of Texas, legally, you don't have to do a lot of this stuff, but that's not what you're being asked to do to stage the World Cup, which is the point. All right, so.
Mary, I have to say this one thing. In the state of Texas, the legislature, during a drought summer with almost 120-degree, days, they minimized the requirement to provide workers breaks. They did it in the summer during the drought, in some instances. So that should tell you.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk about the framework, right? So the framework now, through a process of a year, has been hammered out, I would say. What are the key elements of it that are important? I'm going to start with, again, the dignity down here. What was it that was important for you that in the final draft is in there?
I'll go first on this. I think the key thing is what I mentioned before. The framework includes strong, specific minimum standards, number one. And for the reason you laid out.
What do you mean by minimum standard?
So, for example, it doesn't just say you must pay a minimum wage. It talks about the idea of living wages. It talks about language around freedom of association that goes beyond what the U.S. law says. So in the way you were discussing before, the floor in the U.S. on labor relations is pretty low, but it doesn't set a legally higher standard, but it lays out a path that is much better in terms of protecting people's right to organize. I mean, Matt can speak to other aspects of it, but there are a lot of other aspects of the framework that set those standards. But it also, I think it goes farther than that in that it lays out, here are some of the ways in which host cities and companies can meet these standards. So it gives something of a guide path, I think, to not just you gotta do this, but here are some measurable ways that you can do that. And so I think those are, it's not a perfect document from our perspective, but it does include those key elements. I don't know what you would add.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that we were very careful to make sure that the comprehensive non-discrimination language that was included in the framework was intersectional and reflective of a number of different communities and constituencies that the coalition as a whole worked with, which when we think about the difference in legislation and protections in the US, Canada, and Mexico, that's a challenge because you're then looking at a framework that is potentially more inclusive than, speaking from the US perspective, many laws on the books are in terms of—
Which is, again, the point.
Right, exactly.
Okay, terrific. Matt, from your perspective, what about the framework do you feel at this point is sort of critical that you feel like, we got that right?
Well, I think the comprehensive nature of it, I think we have spent some time to figure out what our salient issues are and then figured out ways in which we can make sure that those issues are being dealt with. Now, those issues are going to vary in terms of their intensity across these different markets, but making sure that everybody's looking at these critical areas, and then people can kind of calibrate as to, local priorities and sort of local needs. But I think for us, the idea that we can make sure that collectively there's readiness, that collectively we're ready across all markets to deal with any of these issues that arise. That's not to suggest that, it's going to be perfect, but just having that sort of collective readiness, that is something we're really proud of.
Okay, great. Now you mentioned risk areas. Just to give, again, let's not talk in high-level terms. Let's get very practical. 6 risk areas, could you say you could articulate?
Yeah.
That's sort of the top 6. Why don't you just give some words to that so people know what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think maybe it would be good to give some sort of market-specific issues. And I think, so I mentioned there's inclusion and safeguarding, there's workers' rights, and there's access to remedy. And there could be various blueprints for that. And I think in North America, there were a couple of issues that we wanted to make sure that we brought forward. One being the rights and well-being of unsheltered populations.
Homelessness.
Yes.
Rights of those who, homeless.
Right. And so these markets are going to be, or these events are going to be happening in the midst of, markets where homelessness is an issue, and we want to make sure that we're dealing with it, that we're not sort of overlooking that issue because there's so many impacted and it is so salient. Responsible policing and thinking about what we need to do in terms of working with police forces and also community groups in tandem to address concerns locally and figure out a way that we can, in each market, have some sort of level of assurance that responsible policing is something we've given adequate attention to. And I think as you go down, we talked about the workers' rights and making sure that workers' rights are on point. And looking at across different markets, you may have certain markets where human rights defenders—
Markets being cities, host cities,
yes.
yep.
So the well-being of human rights defenders and journalists may be a particular concern. So that's something where, okay, that's an issue we want all of the cities looking at, even if it's not sort of known prevalent issue in that particular city. So there's some of those where they're so salient that we said we're going to make this a regional priority. So I think that's a little bit of a flavor.
Can you elaborate very briefly on what you mean by salient?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, salient generally, when we talk about salient issues, we're talking about risks to people. So, risks where there may be a particular individual or community or group affected in connection with our tournament. And so the salience is sort of how many people are going to be impacted and how severe is that impact going to be. And when you look at some of these issues, you may have something where we have a small group of individuals who are impacted, but the impact could be severe, that we may not be able to remediate what happens. And so in those situations, those kind of things have to be escalated. So there is a bit of a science, but also an art in terms of identifying what are the most salient issues and making them a priority.
Okay, terrific. So just bringing some of those to life a little bit. Now, before we go to what's important for happening next and your final thoughts, so I'll leave that for the three of you to think. Matt, I want to ask about Canada and Mexico. We've been talking a lot about the U.S., right? AFL-CIO, A is for American, although it is North America, but it is. But let's talk about Canada and Mexico because it is a three-country World Cup, Continental World Cup. Talk a little bit about engagement with groups in Mexico and Canada around some of the same sort of basically stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So Dignity 2026 in the U.S. is it's really an opportunity because the coalition presented themselves as a formidable sort of coordinated stakeholder group, and that made that engagement. It made the engagement kind of obvious. In some countries and markets, it may not be as obvious. In Mexico, we have Mexico Unido, which is also a labor-led coalition that has organized itself and come to the table, and we've started to engage them. We've engaged them throughout the process of developing this framework. But in both Canada and Mexico, we felt we've had to go further. So we've tried to reach out to local human rights commissions, experts, and different sort of subject matter experts to help us find our way. And we're hoping that, especially when we initiate this next phase of the work, we're going to see both local and national stakeholders really come forward in both countries. And so it's been kind of a mix and match of how we're going about stakeholder engagement across the three countries.
Okay, that's fair. Final thoughts now. As I mentioned before, we have some host cities who are here, but also host cities who weren't able to come, who may be watching, on the UN YouTube channel. What advice do you have now? It's now implementation time. So we've gotten to the point, there's been a commitment, bidding requirements, a strategy, now a framework. Now we're going to work. We're picking up a shovel and we're starting to go to work. What advice do you have for host cities now? And particularly, I'm going to start with Minal as they now start this work. And there's 2.5 years at this point, right? I don't want to 3 years, two and a half years, something like that?
It's plenty of time.
Okay.
It's plenty of time.
Good, don't hit the alarm bells, but Mina, what advice do you have?
You know, I'm talking to amazing city colleagues, so I know they're going to be able to get it done. What it takes to work or function at the city level or at a quasi-government level or a government level is a really unique set of skills. So I'm going to be careful as I couch this as advice when I'm talking to these incredibly smart people, but the very deep listening skills are required, you know, sharing the leadership space, which I said before, it opens it up to really co-own something. I can't tell you how many stakeholders that don't work for the mayor's office, when we see them at a luncheon or something, they introduce themselves as having been on my team for the World Cup bid process.
They're picking up a shovel and helping.
Yeah, and they were. We couldn't have done it without them, right? How am I supposed to know how this will affect somebody in some far corner of the city when it comes to traffic congestion or noise, or whether or not their child will be able to sleep at night for 5 weeks or 6 weeks, right? So those are the things we really have to learn about our communities and their concerns, so that it's a conscientious World Cup for all, right? Not just the elite that can travel and go to it, not just for the elite athletes, and not just for, you know, the folks that have the luxury and the means of doing these things, but for the people that live in our cities and that are impacted by the scale, size, and scope of what's going to happen there for 5 or 6 weeks, as thousands and thousands of people from all over the globe, you know, descend on our cities, right? So that's something we have to think about, and you have to keep them at the very forefront of what you're doing.
You know, and thank you for that, Mina. And Matt, we didn't talk about children, but it's also critical, and one of the key risks is risk to children. And we know from repeated, you know, mega sporting events that all of the risks, be it trafficking, certainly, homelessness, safety, security, and policing, anti-discrimination, as much as that affects, you know, there's an impact that also has on keeping children safe. And that whole aspect of it. So, and actually the center has a program that we're working through the courtesy of the Oak Foundation in several cities, one of them being New York, New Jersey. I'm flying their colors today. There we go, yep, thank you. To specifically engage different agencies within the mayor's and governor's offices to help make sure that the children are protected in particular and that they have voice and agency. But now I'm going to come to Dan and then Lee on what's critical for you now. What advice do you have as we now go to implementation?
So the first thing I will say is that you cannot truly do your human rights due diligence without stakeholder engagement. Full stop, period. It is the floor, not the ceiling. It has to happen. And then the second piece I would say is that in your cities, in your local areas, you already have a wealth of knowledge and expertise in local organizers, local organizations, local activists. Listen to the folks on the ground who are going to be the most impacted by what is happening when the tournament comes to town. And so this is really a time to build that lasting and powerful legacy by prioritizing local knowledge.
Terrific. Matt, any final words?
Yeah, I think, you know, a big part of it is just remembering that the ultimate goal are those genuine win-wins, right? It's those tangible results that the UNGPs talk about, and realizing that there's only really one way to get those genuine win-wins, and that's making sure that the affected stakeholders, the affected individuals and groups are treated as players, not spectators, right? So it's about facilitating that agency, that influence, and that is something that doesn't just happen, it has to be a concerted effort. And so, I mean, I don't mean to, we know this process is going to be hard and imperfect, but I think it's one of those things when you have stakeholders in the game and being treated as players, I'm excited to see what we can do.
Terrific, I love that. Well, in 2 years' time, we're going to check back in with all of you at the next Sporting Chance Forum. We're going to see how it's going, but rest assured, we'll be in the trenches with you. We're working along with you, Matt, to create a community of learning for host cities who now have these human rights responsibilities and helping to bring this brand new world to life. So with that, I'm going to hand us back to Tracy for a few thoughts as we wrap up the Sporting Chance Forum. Thank you to the panel. Well done.
Thanks, Mary, and thank you to the panel. So After about 4 decades of journalism focusing on what sport reveals about our world and putting that through the filter of what we've been hearing here at the Sporting Chance Forum for the last couple of days, here are some very brief reflections from me. Sport is excellent at creating policies. And I'm not talking about human rights policies here, I'm talking about policies generally. Most of those policies have athletes at the very bottom of a power dynamic. Popular narratives will tell us athletes cheat, athletes dope, athletes who are whistleblowers are troublemakers, athletes who are different need to be banned. The truth is that, like Caster Semenya said yesterday, without the athletes, none of us have our jobs and none of our organisations exist. So the takeaways from here are to build successful human rights strategies that actually get to the heart of it. People first, athletes first. Give up some of our power and become a leader instead. Be transparent, build trust, hand some of the power to the people who we and our institutions have taken it from. The fact that you are here means you should be congratulated because you take this topic very seriously. There are plenty of others who are not, and I would encourage you to go away and speak to some of those who exist alongside you in other sports organisations and other institutions and encourage them to turn up next time. The challenge now is to turn the many powerful words that we've heard into powerful actions that will genuinely impact sport positively and in the absolute profound ways that we know is possible. We have to flip this idea that those who have grievances are the problems that we need to solve. Actually, the problem is the abusive behaviours and the ways in which we allow our sports organisations to facilitate it. That is the problem. The victims are actually the partners that we need to combine with to send the message that this sort of behaviour is no longer acceptable. They're my very short reflections. It's been an absolute pleasure being your MC for the past 2 days, and I thank the Centre for asking me to do so. But right now, to wrap up this whole thing and to come full circle, let's hand back to Mary. Mary, thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. You've been terrific. Tracy Holmes, terrific job. Thank you, Tracy, for giving us your skilled hand in guiding us through the last day and a half. So we've come to the end. And I hope that we've taken you on a journey through the UN Guiding Principles and brought it to life. But I think the most important thing that I want to impart from the center is this idea of trust building. You know, people ask, what's the center do? And I give them kind of a response that maybe not is entirely accessible sometimes. I say we hold a safe space for courageous conversations. And so I hope over the last day and a half, you've come to understand what we mean by that safe space for courageous conversation. It's about hearing each other, including hearing hard things and being uncomfortable. But that's how you get to what's possible that's underneath that. Underneath that is our solutions, is trust, is understanding. And so I hope that we've taken you on that journey and that you've gotten that out of this. And depending on where you are in the sport ecosystem, be it a sponsor or a government, broadcaster, a host city, a sports body, an NGO, a trade union, a civil society, every single one of us has a role to play, right? And this isn't about pointing fingers. Everybody has a role in making this happen, in the trust building and the solution finding and in the progress. So I want us to think about that. And as a final note, I want to thank this incredible center team. And I know not all of them are here, but stand up if you work for the Center for Sport and Human Rights, including the volunteers, They have made this possible through the work of all of you. The Center for Sport and Human Rights is absolutely its people, and I often tell people this is the best team I've ever had, and that includes the team that went to the Olympics and won the Olympics. Just because of the amazing dedication they have to their work. Thank you to all of you for traveling far and wide to be here at the Sporting Chance Forum. For those of you who are from host cities, I'm asking you to meet downstairs directly in a couple minutes, down to the ground floor where Nicole, and if you're a host city, you know who Nicole is, will meet you to walk you over to lunch, where we have lunch for you. And I just want to thank all of you for coming far and wide to be a part of this forum. I want to thank our board of directors. I want to thank our members who founded the center and have been a part of us from the very beginning, and all of the people who have been a part of our advisory council and engaged organizations who have brought the center to life. So with that, I wish you safe journeys home, and we will see you back in 2025. Thank you, everyone.